Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 228, part 2. And, well, let's just launch straight into questions, you know why you're here. John McCarthy asks, in the design of USS Constitution and the other American heavy frigates, Joshua Humphreys used diagonal bracing, which anticipated some of the ideas later implemented by Robert Seppings. In other areas of naval architecture, how did their approaches compare? So there obviously was a bit of a convergence going on in late 18th, early 19th century naval architecture. However, there is a little bit of a difference between their styles, which is probably best expressed by looking at those diagonal bracings. So lucky for you, this is one of those Drydock questions that has multiple pictures. Now this picture you might recognise from the video on USS Constitution when I went to tour her, and obviously you can see there is some diagonal bracing going on here. However, when you look around in other parts of the ship during the video, you'll notice it's conspicuous by its absence, and that's because it's not entirely present along the whole of the ship. This is a plan from the USS Constitution Museum itself, and as you can see, there is some basic diagonal bracing going on the gun decks, and then there are these large sweeping braces on the lower decks, but the ship is still mostly traditionally framed. So this does give her hull some additional strength, but as you can see, they are effectively in their areas one way, and they don't cover the entirety of the hull. Now, if you compare that to this cross-section of a British ship of the line of the period that we're talking about, which has the Seppings improvements, and as you can see there lower down in the hull, not only does the diagonal bracing go all the way from bow to stern, but you can also see it's overlapped and continuous the entire way, and that carries through up onto the gun decks as well. So this is kind of a step forward, whereas Constitution is essentially a traditionally framed ship with elements of diagonal bracing to help improve her strength. With the Seppings formula, as you can see, it's an entirely comprehensive change in how you just construct the ship completely, which is what allows the sudden growth in size of first rates and length of frigates that you see going on kind of from the late 1810s onwards. So you could say, I guess, that if Seppings is the next step in naval architecture following the sort of decades to centuries of traditional naval construction with little bits of innovation here and there that preceded him, then Joshua Humphreys is in some ways kind of an intermediate step between the two, I guess. Mainly just because he's a little bit earlier. Snowstalker36 asks, one of my favourite things to study early in college was just how stuffed the US forces would have been if, in the what-if scenario, if they joined the Allies immediately in 1939. It's very bad for air power and armoured vehicles, but how bad would it have been for the surface and submarine fleet? Well, there's a lot of things to consider. So, for example, the latest destroyer in 1939 that's literally just entering commission would be the highly troubled Sims class. They'd still be having top weight issues, so there's a whole raft of small batch destroyer runs between the Sims and the Fletchers. So the Fletchers are a fair way off at the start of World War II. Likewise with the cruisers, the Cleveland is one of the classic US light cruisers of the Second World War, but at the start of World War II in 1939, the Brooklyns are just about, the last Brooklyns are just about being commissioned, and the Clevelands again are a long way off. Wasp isn't in commission, she's still under construction. She won't be ready for about 6 months or so. Hornet is way off. So in terms of aircraft carriers, you've got the Yorktowns and the Lexingtons, and that's it. Admittedly, it's 5 carriers, and 5 decent ones, but you're still down 2 compared to World War II as when the US entered it at the end of 1941. And kind of the list goes on. The North Carolinas are way off, and there's no modernised old-school battleships. The Royal Navy, of course, was in the process of modernising ships. Queen Elizabeth wasn't ready just for the start of World War II, but she was available shortly thereafter. But you had, Valiant, Renown, Queen Elizabeth, and various upgrades that had been done to Barham, Malaya, and the R's in the early 1930s the US battle line, although they had modernizations and upgrades in the interwar period, were a little bit behind the curve on that, because bearing in mind that when Pearl Harbor happens at the end of 1941, Colorado has gone in for a modernization, which is why she's not at Pearl Harbor, but she's the first one of the older US ships that's going to get those kinds of upgrades. So, you know, that's also a bit of an issue. Carrier aircraft, again, I think at some point I actually put up a comparison chart which shows where the various major carrier navies, air fleets were in 1939 versus 1941. And in 1939, both the fighter and dive bomber components of the US carrier arm are both biplanes. The only monoplane they have is the Devastator. And of course, you know, the Mark 13, the Mark 14 torpedoes are still present, but there are issues with them, and there's even fewer of them than there were in 1941, with the relatively slow rate of production. The 20mm Oerlikon and the 40mm Bofors are, again, off into the future. The latest and greatest thing the US has is the Chicago Piano, the 1.1 inch, which obviously has all of its issues, and there's not even as many of those because Admiral King, as covered in the video on Admiral King, made it his policy in the mid to late part of 1941 to try and upgrade the US Navy's anti-aircraft defences. So we're 2 years before that. So the US Navy, you know, its anti-aircraft defences are going to be fairly lacking. So if we take USS Colorado as an example, now she does have some heavy anti-aircraft weaponry, but it's a grand total of 8 single 5-inch 25 caliber guns, and that's it. I mean, okay, yeah, there's some 50 cal machine guns around there as well, but that doesn't really count. And of course, this is the era long before VT fuses. Now, granted, okay, contemporary British battleships like the QEs and the Rs tended to have 4 twin 4-inch, so the same number of barrels for the heavy anti-aircraft armament, but they also did tend to have at least a couple of octuple pom-poms for close-in air defence, which accounts for something, as opposed to 50 cal machine guns, which they also had, but as I said, don't really count. Now, of course, the US Navy still has numbers because it's been rearming to a certain extent in the late 1930s, and it started out the 1930s as, you know, the joint largest fleet on the planet. So it's not all bad, but it possesses pretty much all the weaknesses that would be shown in 1942 with, you know, various battles, including the Guadalcanal campaign, except even more so because they haven't had a chance to learn from observing the first couple of years of the Second World War. And in terms of modernising their ships and their equipment, they are a little bit behind the curve compared to the Royal Navy in a number of aspects. Not necessarily all, but a reasonable number of aspects. And their main modernisation of older ships and construction program for new ships hasn't yet quite kicked in. And as I said, mainly because they were just a little bit behind the curve on rearming themselves as compared to the British. Now, that did have some benefits, of course, because it meant the North Carolinas were in a slightly less advanced state of construction compared to King George V, so they'll eventually emerge with 16 instead of 14-inch guns. But for a navy that gets going to war in 1939, well, look at the kinds of losses that the Royal Navy took between the start of the war in 1939 and the end of 1941. And if the US Navy is getting as stuck in, you can probably anticipate seeing roughly similar, if not maybe slightly worse levels of loss if they're confronting the same opposition, with the caveat, of course, that overall losses of both the Royal and US Navies might come down slightly, because if they're operating together against Germany and then later Italy, well, they have a lot more force to bring to bear. Fred the Red asks, can you tell us a little bit about the history of ships being referred to by their number of guns, like 10 gun, 98 gun, and so on? Is this a system created after the fact by historians, or was it used at the time by the Royal Navy? And if so, when did it start being used? Did other navies use it as well? And is it possible to determine the last ship that was referred to by its number of guns? Referring to ships by the number of their guns is definitely a historical thing. However, it's something that kind of phases in the latter part of the 1600s and then going into the early 1700s, because prior to that, ships ships, when they were recorded, you would have the number of their guns recorded, and quite often in extensive detail, because you had everything from tiny anti-swivel guns, which were counted all the way up to culverins. But in terms of classifying the ship, as in saying this is a, insert descriptor here, ship, you either had great ships and frigates, or you would have groups, and if you were rating them by something the ship carried, it was in the 1600s, it was usually by number of men rather than number of guns. But towards the end of the 1600s, as I said, and then into the early 1700s, what tended to happen is swivel guns and so forth, well, the sheer number of them tended to drop away, but also the people stopped counting them towards the ship's main battery, and the main batteries themselves started to become a lot more standardized. So rather than having a mixed battery gun deck, which might have culverins, demi-culverins, cannon, demi-cannon, etc., you would just have a single row of like guns, and also they started to refer to them by the poundage of their shot rather than by these various older titles. And as the gun arm therefore became more uniform and more referred to just in terms of the anti-ship weaponry, not the anti-personnel weaponry, then you start to see people referring to ships more by their gun numbers as well as their rates, and the rates start to come in the early 1700s, mostly as, believe it or not, an economy measure to try and fix and standardize certain classes and sizes of ship. But because most of the time within a given rate, it usually settles down either by diktat or by habit within each rate as being a specific kind of ship. So, later on the 74 gunner becomes the typical third rate, even though 64 gunners technically are also third rates, and so are 80 gunners. But the 74 becomes almost interchangeable with the third rate because so many third rates are 74s, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, the 1700s is where it really gets going, and that carries through into the 1800s, i.e. the 19th century. But in terms of other navies using it, they picked it up pretty quickly because it was a very handy way of referring to ships and referring to their relative strengths. And when it comes to the last ship that's referred to by the number of its guns, that is a lot more difficult because the rating of ships according to their guns starts to become less and less practical as the ironclad era develops. Firstly, because you have something like Warrior, which technically, by the fact it has a single gun deck and by the number of guns it carries, classifies itself as would be classified as a frigate, but is clearly blatantly far more powerful than sort of 130, 140, 150 gun ships of the line. And so that's kind of when the rating by number of gun system starts to fall away somewhat, because it's no longer a viable way of completely rating a ship's combat power relative to other ships. But also, as you progress through the ironclad era, you go from when you have the broadside battery ironclads, where if you kind of have a cut-off of, right, these are the iron armoured ships versus the older ships, you could potentially start to make a rating again, because they just tend to carry lots of the standard gun. So Warrior's designed to carry just a battery of the 68-pounders, which is kind of becoming the Navy's standard gun at that point, at least the standard heavy gun. She's modified for 110-pounders, but broadly speaking, the early broadside ironclads you can still approximately rate by the number of their broadside guns, because they're, depending on whether you're looking at Gloire or Warrior, etc., they're mostly in the ballpark. I mean, the 68-pounder is one of the better ones, and the 110-pounder is definitely one of the worst. But they're near enough in the ballpark that you can sort of rate by number of guns. The same way, that first rate carries 32-pounders and sixth rate doesn't, but you still just refer to number of guns. But very rapidly during the 1860s, you get ships like the US Monitors, which carry very few, 2 or 4 very large guns, And then you start to get the central battery ironclads coming in as well, which similarly will carry fewer larger weapons. And then all of a sudden, rating ships by their number of guns is no longer really a viable option, because a ship that's carrying, 4 15-inch guns, is that more or less powerful than a ship that's carrying 30 68-pounders, or whatever. And so that's the 1860s is kind of when this rating system starts to die away, but exactly which ship is the last to be officially described and led primarily by number of guns, I don't know. Paul from Chicago asks, on August 7th, 1914, for reasons not adequately explored, Troubridge shouts, "Leroy Jenkins!" and attacks Goeben and Breslau. Can his 4 modern armoured cruisers and 8 destroyers stop or sink the German squadron despite attacking in daylight? Now, this is something of a matter of considerable debate. As you will have found in the video on Admiral Cunningham earlier this week, he was actually there. He was in command of HMS Scorpion, which would have been one of the destroyers engaged. But of the 8, only 3 destroyers, including Scorpion with Cunningham aboard, would have actually been available for the engagement with the Germans, because a collier had gone to the wrong port, so the other destroyers were basically out of coal. Now, as I said, this has been argued back and forth by a lot of naval historians. Despite the 5 of the destroyers having to drop out, I tend to think that Troubridge might have stood a decent chance. For one thing, he has, even if we discount the 6-inch guns, so we just say, okay, anything that's 6-inch or smaller is either going to be part of a secondary gun duel between Goeben and whatever it's firing at, and or is going to be shooting at Breslau, which, against any of these armoured cruisers is pretty much a non-entity. Then you've got, if I haven't miscalculated, you've got 16 9.2-inch guns and 7 7.5-inch guns that you can aim at Goeben in the combined broadside of the 4 armoured cruisers, with the additional factor that a good number of those guns, if Goeben manages to score hits that disable the turrets, a good number of those guns are wing-mounted. Now, obviously, theoretically, that's a bad thing, because it means the ships actually are carrying significantly more 7.5 and 9.2-inch guns than they can bring to bear on the broadside. But it does also mean that if a ship gets badly chewed up on one side but isn't in danger of sinking, it can wheel around and present a relatively fresh broadside, assuming that one of the 4 aft 9.2-inch mounts hasn't been knocked out. Now, some of the points that are raised against Troubridge engaging are that he is apparently slower than Goeben. Not actually true. His armoured cruisers are, in theory, if they pile on all the power, capable of 23 knots. Goeben is sometimes cited as being capable of 27 knots, which is a blatant lie, because, yes, Goeben and Moltke can reach 27 knots in very specific sea conditions, in specifically chosen seaways that enhance their speed, with sort of the best coal in the world, and specially chosen hand-picked boiler crews, and in a light load condition. Neither Goeben nor Moltke would ever make anything close to that speed in actual, reality during operations in World War One. And on top of that, Goeben had issues with her boilers, which meant that she was averaging about 24 knots. So yes, technically Goeben has a speed advantage, but it's a speed advantage of 1 knot, which, sea conditions or the wind could change that completely. So, yeah, in actual fact, there isn't that much of a speed difference. And, of course, the destroyers are faster. Then you also have the armour argument. People point out, yes, well, the British armoured cruisers, their armour is only 6 inches thick, whereas Goeben's is 11 inches. Well, yes, that's true, but that doesn't put the British armoured cruisers in any worse position than an invincible class, and puts them in a better position than an indefatigable class when it comes to taking on Goeben. So, yeah, it's not a brilliant situation to be in, facing 11-inch guns, but it's certainly not a step down from the battle cruisers that are following Goeben, and they seemed perfectly happy to go toe-to-toe with her if they'd managed to catch her. So, the armour argument, I think, falls down. The speed armament definitely falls down. And it just comes down to the firepower. Now, yes, granted, unless they're pretty much at absolute point blank, the 9.2 and 7.5 inch guns are not going to be breaching Goebern's primary defences in terms of the main armoured section of her belt. However, as has been seen in numerous naval engagements, you don't have to do that in order to cripple, slow down, etc. a capital ship. If you blow up the command crew, you blow up the rangefinders, you open up holes in the deck, you open up holes in the unarmoured portions or the lesser armoured portions of the hull and start flooding and fires and so forth, penetrating casemates. All of this can contribute to disabling a ship's ability to fight and its ability to run. Now, granted, Goeben starting out with relatively fresh gunnery crews and with none of that having happened to her is probably going to make a complete and utter mess of at least one, possibly more of the armoured cruisers. But the armoured cruisers have torpedoes, launchers of their own. They're in the way. Goeben has to go past them somehow. So, because if Goeben decides, okay, well, these British ships are coming out of the east, which is another factor. Okay, Troubridge estimates he's going to engage them in the morning, but he's going to have the sun at his back. It's not going to be as low as he would have liked at dawn, but it's still going to be an issue for the German rangefinders, whereas he's got the light at his back, so Goeben is being wonderfully highlighted for him. And not only has Goeben got to worry about the armoured cruisers, you do have those 3 destroyers coming in. So if those destroyers are coming in and launching torpedo attacks, Goeben has a very difficult choice to make, because she can stay straight and level and utilise her fire control equipment to try and get good firing solutions on the armoured cruisers and start knocking them about. But that means staying in a straight line and possibly getting hit by torpedoes. Or she can start evading the destroyers and firing on them, which of course means less guns pointing at the armoured cruisers, and it means Goeben is messing up her own firing solution on the armoured cruisers. If the armoured cruisers are less engaged, then they have more stable and almost practice-like conditions to deal with Goeben, and they can allocate one of the armoured cruisers to deal with Breslau, assuming Breslau tries to get involved. At which point Goeben is on a little bit of a time crunch, because she's got 2 battle cruisers following her. Now, of course, the battle cruisers are nowhere near close enough for them to actually intervene in this battle, but every hour spent either trying to manoeuvre around or engaging Troubridge is another hour in which the British battle cruisers will eventually be closing down Goeben, and any torpedo hit or any major shell hit that causes flooding is also going to slow down Goeben, which makes her, again, easier to catch. Plus, of course, at some point it's possible, depending on how you rate it, maybe even highly likely, that the sheer hail of 9.2 inch and 7.5 inch fire is going to burn and blow up enough stuff in Goeben's upper works as to render her relatively combat ineffective. Now, with all that said, would Troubridge's squadron have outright defeated Goeben? It's possible, but very unlikely. Mainly because that final stage of actually sinking Goeben would be relatively difficult. In order for Troubridge's squadron to actually defeat Goeben and Breslau, now I think Breslau's definitely going to die, but to defeat Goeben, they have to incapacitate Goeben's ability to fire back quickly enough so that they don't lose too many of the armoured cruisers, and they would probably have to rely on the destroyer torpedo attacks slowing Goeben down enough for the armoured cruisers to get in position to make their own torpedo attack, and that's how they could actually kill Goeben, put enough torpedoes into her once she's unable to really do anything about it, and she will go down. But that is a highly optimistic, albeit possible, way it could have gone down. Of course, the opposite version, the highly optimistic version for the Germans, is that Goeben somehow just picks them all off at range with her 11-inch guns because Troubridge and the destroyers don't make any real effort to close, and he's happy to accept the fact that, the battle cruisers are inevitably grinding ever closer to him, which is also, again, a possible but unlikely outcome. The more middling ground outcome is that Troubridge's squadron itself is probably tactically defeated, as in it's forced to cede the field after losing one or more ships and taking damage to others. But the resultant damage they're likely to inflict on Goeben and sinking Breslau is likely to leave Goeben in a state whereby she can't even maintain 24 knots. She's probably going to be significantly slowed down still further, which in turn will mean a battered and slowed Goeben will then end up under the guns of the battle cruisers that are chasing her, because she won't be able to reach the Dardanelles in time, which overall would be a strategic victory for the British. I mean, yes, they would have lost more ships most likely, but I think the British would be happy to trade a few older armoured cruisers in exchange for destroying Goeben, particularly, and Breslau as a bonus. Video Dude 26 asks, what about a Pacific War in 1938? Assuming that the Panay incident spiraled out of control and the US and Japan had gone to war in January of 1938, the US is usually derided as being woefully unprepared for war in 1941. Presumably this is even more true if war had come 3 years earlier. But what about Japanese readiness? How would the two naval powers compare, assuming that Europe stays out of it, which means the US can pull its Atlantic forces in as well? Would there be a Western Pacific Jutland-style line of battle engagement? Relatively unlikely on the battle line engagement, bearing in mind at this point the Pacific Fleet is still based down in San Diego, not in Pearl Harbor, and by 1938 the US war plans had already shifted quite considerably towards the island hopping version, which is, related to fairly strongly what they actually ended up doing in the Second World War. So by 1938, the US is not envisaging packing all of its ships up together and shipping out to go and fight the Japanese off the Philippines, albeit that they might have forward deployed to Pearl Harbor. But the flip side is that, much as the slightly earlier question on if the US had joined World War II in 1939, in 1938, a lot of what I said there pretty much applies to that scenario. But it also applies to the Japanese. The Japanese don't have the Yamatos, for example. The Shikakus are not ready. Soryu and Hiryu are just about getting their feet wet. I mean, technically speaking, in 1938, Hiryu is not actually even commissioned yet, although Soryu is. So the Japanese carrier fleet actually has, even in 1938, the Japanese carrier fleet has even more of a knock on it than the US carrier forces do, because the US are down Wasp and Hornet, the Japanese are down the two Shikakus, which are, two of the most capable carriers in the world in 1941, plus Hiryu. So they only have Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, plus maybe, Hosho technically, maybe a few conversions if they scare some up fairly quickly. Granted, Enterprise is commissioning during 1938, but it is at the beginning of 1938, so we're going to allow it. The other thing, of course, is that if the Panay incident spirals out of control, Japan is still quite significantly focused on China. It's not going to have the full details of its plan for advance into the Pacific ready to go, the same way they did in 1941, and of course they're very unlikely to pull together a Pearl Harbor between the Panay incident going south and, the war itself kicking off. In fact, I'd say it's pretty much impossible, because apart from anything else, the changes and modifications they made to their torpedoes to allow them to pull off Pearl Harbor in large part, as well as, converting 16-inch shells into bombs, none of that's happened, and they're not going to crash course it in any plausible timeline. So, on the one hand, everybody is significantly reduced. On the other hand, the Japanese are probably on slightly more of a back foot, because some of their key units, not just carriers and battleships, but also in terms of cruisers and destroyers, are not present. And on top of that, they are starting out facing against a full-strength US fleet, so there's a lot more targets apart from anything else, because they haven't got Pearl Harbor under their belts. Which means that although it would be a very interesting war, neither side really at that point has any significant anti-aircraft capability outside of their fighters to speak of. It's going to be a confrontation which broadly favours the US more so than 1942 did, basically because they're, as I said, they're going in with roughly the same levels of preparation rather than the Japanese having rigged the game table a little bit, and they're also going in with their full strength fleet to start with. Now, it could go very badly. As I say, there is a relative lack of anti-aircraft capability in both fleets, but the Japanese, if they catch the US fleet or a US fleet of some description in open water with their carriers, they're more likely to do significant damage to the US than vice versa, again because of the torpedo issues. The flip side, of course, being that the Japanese have even fewer aircraft carriers with less air defense, so US dive bombers could pull off a Midway. There's nothing really to stop them doing that in 1938. The lesser capabilities of the strike aircraft being compensated for by the lesser anti-aircraft capabilities. So it's possible you might end up with some kind of battle line engagement, but it won't be a full-on Kantai-Kessen, Jutland-ish engagement. If it happens, it'll be because both sides' carrier forces have chewed each other up, and one side or the other is going for something that the other side perceives as critical, at which point it's going to be more of a meeting engagement than anything else. But broadly, I would tend to think that the US has the overall advantage for the reasons I explained earlier, and also the fact that now they can kick their war machine into industrial high gear production. So there might be a little bit of lag because they've now got to lay down ships from the get-go. The Japanese obviously have Hiryu about to come online. They have Shikaku. The Shikaku's technically already in the works, and Yamato is going to be a bit of a shock, but all of that is a lot further down the line, and the US can probably pick that up and come back round ahead much, much faster. Not to mention, obviously, they're starting off with a numerical advantage. Duke Master asks, you're in a thinly armoured or unarmoured ship and get hit by a large caliber AP shell. It has no chance of detonating inside the ship. Unless it directly hits something important and demolishes it, what kind of damage can you realistically expect to take from an over-penetration? Well, and partly, it depends where it hits, because obviously if it hits at or near the waterline, you're going to have flooding, which is going to have all sorts of interesting effects. But if we're assuming, for the sake of argument and simplicity, that the shell is hitting somewhat above the waterline, so we're not having immediate flooding issues as well, something that's not perhaps always appreciated is that usually an over-penetrating shell causes progressively larger holes as it goes through the ship. So if you've seen the video on the damage that Seydlitz took, you might look at it and think, oh, well, look, there's these tiny little holes being poked in the ship. So that's surely not doing too much damage, especially the ones that go through and through. But when you look at the exit of the through and through, pretty much similar to when you look at most exit wounds caused by regular bullets, that's considerably larger. And there is a rather wonderful shot, which I can't find for the life of me, but I know I've seen it recently, which I think was a shot from the interior of Jean Bart, when one of Massachusetts' 16-inch shells came in and failed to detonate properly because the fuse was dodgy. And you can see because it's shot from inside, you can see the hole in the exterior of the ship is almost just about 16 inches across. It's a little bit bigger, obviously, but near enough. But as the holes progressively punch through more and more bulkheads and decks, you can see the hole itself getting larger and larger. And that's because usually the shell will start to tumble. And obviously when the shell goes through whatever outer hull plating you've got, whatever it's destroyed coming in, plus potentially rivets if you're a riveted ship, has now become shrapnel. And possibly the shell might also start to break up, depending on the relative caliber of shell versus how much stuff it's punching through and how strong it is. But even if the shell doesn't break up, you're going to have, the windscreen is definitely going to be now part of the shrapnel, along with anything it hits on the way through. So not just the hull that it's hit to penetrate the ship, you've got stuff that's inside the compartment that it's going to turn into shrapnel and bring with it. You've also got the shockwave, the air pressure shockwave of something bursting into an enclosed compartment at very high speed. That's going to tear up stuff as well. And all of this, by the time it exits the other side, you're going to have this tumbling projectile that's still imparting energy, plus this storm of shrapnel that it's generated with it, and a series of expanding air shock waves also coming along. So, assuming, as per the question, that it's not directly hitting something important and demolishing it, and it's also not detonating, what you're going to end up with is whichever compartments it's passed through are going to be ruined. You're going to have probably an increasingly large, increasing in size number of holes punching through the ship. And also potentially stuff in adjacent compartments, both above, below, and to the sides, might also be damaged by overpressure or shrapnel or whatever being blown about through, etc., etc. Which, if it's gone through an empty mess galley or something, it's going to be somewhat disruptive to the crew's next meal, but that's not necessarily too bad. If it's shredded accommodation quarters, well, again, you can move bunks around. People might be a bit upset about some personal possessions getting destroyed. But equally, it could be passing through compartments and cutting off communications, cutting off power, cutting off hoists. There's a lot of very vital stuff in ships that it could destroy and damage just via overpenetration. And of course, anyone in its path who's unfortunate enough to be there is probably not going to live. DM Phoenix asks, I would like to hear your engineering opinion on the principles, pros and cons behind the liquid-void anti-torpedo protection system, and what makes this superior to, say, extending the main armour belt all the way down another few metres, or any of the other anti-torpedo designs, such as the Pugliese system, anti-torpedo nets, and Kohler's armour methods, for example. So the primary con of a liquid-void, or void-liquid, whichever way you want to do it, anti-torpedo protection scheme is it takes up space and weight that you could otherwise use elsewhere for other purposes in the ship. That's the main disadvantage of it. The idea of the multiple layers of liquid and void is basically that the liquid section will absorb more energy. So the blast of the torpedo and shrapnel caused by the torpedo's explosion, all of that is better absorbed by a liquid layer. However, liquid is also very good at transmitting shock. So whilst the expansion of the gas bubble caused by the torpedo and the fragments that it's causing will be mitigated by having to pass through a liquid layer, the actual shock of the torpedo detonation will pass through to the next layer, relatively speaking, unimpeded. So the exterior destruction will be a bit less compared to if you have the void layer first, at which point a very large section of your outer hull plating might be blown away or dished in or whatever, and the fragments are going to get into the ship to the next layer of bulkheads pretty much without much stopping them. And the other disadvantage of putting your void first is, of course, that then you get flooding immediately, whereas if the liquid system is first, well, there's already liquid there. But you can do it either way around. And then, of course, when the shrapnel, the blast, etc., reaches the next layer, so if you've started with liquid first, you then get to the void. The void makes the further transmission of blast and shock effects much more difficult, and it's the blast and the gas bubble and the shrapnel has all been reduced by the first liquid layer, and so a dissipated collection of blast and shrapnel then goes into the next liquid layer, which slows it down the shrapnel further, but transmits the shock through to then dissipate somewhat more in the next void layer, and so forth. And if you're doing it the other way around, then obviously the explosion is spread out over a large area, but with high-speed shrapnel hits your first liquid layer having breached the void, and so on and so forth, etc. You get the general point. It's basically a gradual step-down mitigation of the two main aspects of a torpedo explosion, which neither liquid nor void can fully deal with, but in combination they can. Now, compared to the other designs, coal as armour, that basically works in terms of just the sheer mass of coal absorbing a lot of the energy, and also the coal is usually buoyant, which means if the coal bunker gets flooded, it's not got quite the same effect on the ship's stability as if just an empty area was flooded. The coal retaining some of that area's buoyancy. The problem with coal as armour is, one, once that starts flooding, it cuts off your access to your fuel, assuming you're using your coal as fuel. Two, if you're using that coal bunker, you're going to have access hatches on the inside of that coal bunker, and those access hatches, when that initial blast comes through, may well be broken or displaced or jammed or blown off or whatever, at which point water is going to come pouring through the coal and into your machinery spaces, which is not good. So coal as armour, to be honest, works better against shells than against torpedoes. It's a stopgap measure against torpedoes. It's better than nothing, but it's not particularly brilliant. Anti-torpedo nets, of course, if they can catch the torpedo and detonate it away from the ship, that's the best way of dealing with the torpedo, because then your ship takes very little to no damage as a result. The main problems with the anti-torpedo net system is it slows you down a lot. So, and you can't necessarily run at high speed at all without the risk of ripping them off. So it's much, much better if you're anchored. But if you want to get underway at speed, you can't really do that with an anti-torpedo net system deployed. Also, the torpedo net has to get progressively heavier and heavier and heavier as torpedoes get faster and larger and heavier, and some of them even have torpedo net cutters mounted on them. And obviously, if you're relying purely on your anti-torpedo nets and a torpedo breaks through the net, you're in a lot of trouble. Plus, it was found at Jutland, for example, that having the torpedo nets furled up against the side of the ship made damage control a lot more difficult, so it complicates other elements of your ship's resistivity. The Pugliese system, on paper, works very well, in that it can completely absorb the power of a torpedo if it gets hit. The two main problems with it compared to the liquid void system, or void liquid whatever, is that, one, the Pugliese system is in some ways kind of binary. The way it theoretically works by having this cylinder absorb most of the power of the torpedo by crushing. Once you get down below a certain diameter of cylinder, the effect kind of just mostly stops. So obviously you have to thin down the torpedo protection system as you get towards the ends of the ship, because the ends of the ship are getting narrower. And at some point, that system, you might still have it, and it's going to take up an awful lot of volume, but it's no longer going to be of really any much use. And of course, where exactly that point happens will depend greatly on what torpedo you're being hit by. It'll be more effective at thinner diameters, at small diameters, against an 18-inch aerial torpedo than it will be against, say, a 21-inch submarine or surface-launched torpedo. Plus, as I said, it does take up a huge amount of volume compared to a liquid void system. But the other main issue with the Pugliese system is that for it to work, it's basically a very, very high precision engineered bit of kit. If you get something wrong with a weld or something, the whole thing could pretty much be a write-off. Whereas with the liquid void system, it's relatively simple. You can literally patch it up, pump things out, and restore the bulk of its functionality without having to get into fine precision engineering. So it makes repairs a lot easier. And finally, if you're extending the main armor belt down all the way, this becomes even more of a difficult binary system, because in theory, at least against smaller torpedo warheads, just presenting a massive slab of metal would stop the explosion cold. The problem is that because the armor is rigid, it basically either stops it or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, and that can be in many ways. It could be that maybe the armor plate itself actually holds, but the supporting beams behind it don't, so the armor plate is just displaced inwards, and we've seen that happen on ships that have taken torpedo hits on their armor belt, and we've seen that happen on ships that have taken shell hits to their armor belts. And if that armor belt gets displaced inward, not only has that done massive structural damage to the local area of your ship, but you now have, potentially something the size of an entire armor plate, which is now just a massive hole in the ship. Also, the armor plate could break, at which point it's just, again, you've got an armor plate sized hole, if not greater, in the side of your ship, and a bunch of heavy, thick armor plates have just been turned into shrapnel, which is going to punch even deeper into your ship. Or it could crack, and again, massive flooding, etc. Basically, just using your main armor belt doesn't work unless you have a massively thick armor belt and you're only ever going to get hit by relatively small torpedo warheads. The thickest plausible armor belt, so King George V or Yamato, etc., if it's just that and you take a hit from a reasonably sized torpedo warhead, between the shrapnel that it generates and the fractures, etc., you probably would have just been better off with just the double hull skin rather than taking a hit on the armor. John Plate asks, I was reading about the Dardanelles operation. Did the British know about the Dardanelles gun, and what kind of damage could that do to a ship of the line? And if so, is there any way to mount it on a ship? So, by the context and the reference to the Dardanelles gun, I'm presuming you're meaning the 1807 Dardanelles operation. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, this was a rather paradoxical operation with some shades of Gallipoli to a degree, except at this point, technically the Ottomans and the Russians were both allied with the British against the French, but the Ottomans and the Russians were on the verge of also going to war with each other, which the British didn't want, because obviously they'd rather everyone concentrate on the French, and if the Ottomans go to war with the Russians, that's going to draw Russian efforts away from fighting the French. And so they sent a naval force to try and persuade the Ottomans not to do that, and if that failed, then to threaten them into not doing that. Due to various circumstances, the British were able to get through the Dardanelles themselves without too much in the way of opposition, and then showed up off of Constantinople, which is exactly what they also wanted to do in 1915. And then, well, in 1915 and in theory in 1807, the next step would have been to bombard Constantinople and or destroy the Ottoman fleet in port, or persuade them to come out and fight and destroy them at the sea in order to force the Ottomans to back down and not do the things that the British didn't want them to do. However, for various bizarre reasons, Duckworth and Smith, the two British commanders, just kind of sat there outside Constantinople and hoped that the Ottomans would kind of stop, and sent them a few letters saying, please stop. And the Ottomans kind of looked at them and went, no. Why should we? You're not actually doing anything to make us other than sitting in a vaguely threatening manner outside our port, which we're not really that impressed by. And so this kind of exchange went back and forth for a few weeks, and then having realised that sending angry letters at the Ottomans probably wasn't going to work, the British fleet sailed back through the Dardanelles, at which point the Ottomans had, woken up a little bit and gotten their forts in order and engaged the British ships on their way back through, which actually did a fair bit of damage to the British ships, and then the whole thing kind of just, was mostly ignored, except for the fact the Ottomans then ended up at war with Russia anyway, which led to a whole series of battles and so on and so forth, and basically a lot of the stuff the British wanted to avoid happened. Now, in terms of did they know about the Dardanelles gun, as an active military threat, probably not. There may have been someone who was conceptually aware of it, but considering the thing had been cast in the 1400s, the Germans thought Osnaburg Fortress was a non-entity because it was 40 years out of date. This thing was hundreds of years old at that point, so I don't think they really rated it as much of a threat, albeit there were a few other big guns like that as well around. And ultimately, their fairly slow rate of fire does make them relatively ineffective as anti-shipping weapons. However, they did get the Dardanelles gun and its cousins did get a few shots off at the British ships as they left, and one or two were reputed to have hit. And the damage that they did was fairly substantial. It wasn't obviously enough to sink a ship of the line, Potentially it might have if they'd got a few hits at the waterline, but that doesn't appear to have happened. However, having, a 41, 42-inch solid stone ball come sailing through your ship leaves a fairly substantial hole and generates a lot of splinters and can cause a lot of casualties on the way through, which it did. I think Sidney Smith's flagship took a hit or two from the thing. So, yeah, it could do a lot of damage with a single hit, but being a solid shot, that is still a relatively contained damage. Is there any way of mounting it on the ship? In theory, yeah, you could, maybe stick it on a bomb vessel or something, but its rate of fire on a ship is going to be even lower than its rate of fire on land. And in the time it takes you to get one shot off that may or may not do eventually fatal damage, anything you're likely to be shooting at is going to have long ago blasted you to pieces. Eric J. Van Dooting asks, what was the typical procedure for protection of a newly completed capital ship departing from the east coast of the US during World War II? Would they sail with a full task of escorts on trials and shakedown cruises? And how much of a threat did U-boats operating off of the east coast present? So something can be gleaned from comparing the shakedown trials of North Carolina and Washington, which occurred before the US entered World War II officially, with the shakedown trials of the South Dakotas and Iowas, which occurred after the US had entered the war. So North Carolina and Washington both did extensive shakedown trials and cruises off of the East Coast and in the Caribbean, pretty much from the word go. Whereas if you look at the records of most of the South Dakotas and Iowas, a lot of their initial testing, which might otherwise have been done somewhere in the mid-ocean, things like working up machinery to full power, etc., a lot of those were done in rivers or in closed harbours. And then when it came down for the actual full shakedown trial, shakedown cruise trial speeds, etc., when they departed, they were given an escort. So a typical one, say, for South Dakota, 4 destroyers escorting against U-boats. And when you look at the footage of Iowa on her shakedown cruise, whilst you don't directly see the escort as a whole in the background, for one thing, her gunnery trials, etc., are being filmed from off-board the ship, so clearly someone else is there. And even from some of the film that's taken aboard the ship, when you can see the ship's wake, you'll also notice the trail of at least 2 other wakes, possibly more, which would indicate there are multiple ships in attendance, so she probably has a similar escort. Exactly what the escort was for every single US fast battleship of the South Dakota and Iowa class while they're on the shakedown trials, I don't know, but it seems that something in the vicinity of a quartet of destroyers was probably typical. As far as how much of a threat did U-boats operating off the East Coast present, well, that's the reason for the escort. You definitely don't want your brand new battleship to be sent immediately to the bottom by a very lucky Type 7 or Type 9 driver. But with that said, the presence of U-boats off of the East Coast was a relatively continuous thing, but it spikes and fades depending on what the U-boats are doing in that particular month or year. Plus, the battleships are somewhat more difficult of a target. So there's a reason why, for example, something like the Queen Mary was allowed to proceed without escort as a high-speed troop transport, because fast targets, i.e. targets moving pretty much above 20 knots, and obviously in the case of US fast battleships can move considerably faster than that, are much, much more difficult for U-boats to target than slow merchant convoys that might be moving at 8 to 12 knots. Because at 8 to 12 knots, if a U-boat's going full out underwater, it might be able to just about keep up with that, and therefore has a much greater radius of interception. It's much easier to set up an attack, and you can outpace and position yourself ahead by moving on the surface at night. Whereas if a battleship's cruising at 18, 20, 24 knots or something like that, that's faster than the U-boat can go, even if the U-boat is dumb enough to come up on the surface in the vicinity, which essentially means that the battleship pretty much almost have to run over the U-boat for the U-boat to get an interception solution. So it's not a ship on trials, a battleship on trials off the East Coast is not at as much risk as a merchant convoy would be, but there is still some risk. hence the destroyer escort. And also, they might slow down at points. Salty Viking 1022 asks, what would you recommend to improve the Konigsberg and Nurnberg class cruisers if you're still stuck with their displacement? Would they work as Atlanta-style cruisers with 128cm guns taken from German destroyer designs? And do you think Germany made a good call in building the Deutschland class or not? And if not, what do you think they should have done? The Deutschland class is a difficult one because if they were any other navy, then they would be a massive mistake. But the Germans were operating under very, very tight constraints because of the Versailles Treaty. And unfortunately, there's a certain amount of national prestige that's coming into things as well, because the Deutschlands, remember, are supposed to be replacing some of the pre-dreadnought battleships that they've got and, were allowed after Versailles. Which means that although in theory, from a purely practical perspective, some kind of coastal defence ship or just a decent heavy cruiser with 8-inch guns would probably be the better option. They've also got to consider that, they might be pre-dreadnoughts, but they're at least pre-dreadnoughts with capital ship grade weaponry, whereas if the flagship of the once mighty German fleet is going to be a heavy cruiser with no particularly great combat advantage over some of the other heavy cruisers, that is quite humiliation. And so something like the Deutschland class, in principle, given those political considerations, etc., it's not a terrible idea. It's not a brilliant one either. And thinking that they're going to do anything particularly useful as commerce raiders is very fanciful. But, they're not the worst idea that someone's ever had. Now, as far as the Konigsberg and Nurnbergs, they're a bit of an interesting one. There's a lot of stuff that really didn't come out very well, but again, a lot of it is, because of the constraints on displacement. But the flip side to that is there are other small light cruisers in this realm of displacement, which are considerably better in terms of protection, in terms of stability, etc., etc. Probably the best example is the Argentinian La Argentina. Okay, it post-dates the Königsbergs by about a decade, but it has 666-inch, 3 666-inch. The Königsbergs and the Leipzigs have 3 5.9-inch. And the La Argentina design, the turrets are actually somewhat heavier by a little bit, but at this kind of displacement, that makes a lot of difference. The Argentinian ship sits basically dead center between the Leipzig and Königsberg classes in terms of displacement. It is a couple of knots slower, granted, but it's also shorter but beamier, which probably helps considerably with the stability. It has a better anti-aircraft suite, and although the flip side, the Germans have twice as many torpedoes, but overall, the Argentinian ship is actually better protected as well. And La Argentina was a very successful design and, continued on for decades. So it can be done. Quite what happened when the Germans were designing, if anything, I think if I was going to change the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs, I'd make them similar to La Argentina. I'd make them shorter but beamier, which would probably solve a lot of the stability and strength issues. I would also revert to a slightly more conventional layout. So now that I have more beam rather than this very narrow tapering tail thing going, which the German ships have going on, that would allow me to move the machinery further back. That would allow me to then move, if the machinery is moved further back, the superstructure can come further back, and then I can put 2 of my triple turrets forward in a super firing pair, which actually would work, I think personally would work a lot better. I could then obviously have my aft turret can move further forwards, which is also good. And I would probably move my aircraft handling facilities to more of a US battleship style arrangement right aft, which would allow me to bring my main armament even further forward. And overall, that compacts my machinery and main battery spaces, which means that potentially I could then take that saved weight and go either into maybe a bit more protection, or potentially making them flush deck cruisers, but flush deck at the height of the forecastle deck, which would again improve seakeeping and accommodation and so forth. But assuming that we continue with the broken forecastle approach, the step down, then it would probably look roughly something like this if you imagine a aircraft catapult there at the back as well. Unemployed history major asks, speaking purely from an engineering standpoint, hand-waving away canal passage, harbour passage, draft considerations, etc., how big can a ship be before it's impossible to move or sinks immediately? Is there a size where you've created an object with so much mass and drag it could never begin to move under its own power? In terms of being able to move, I don't think you'd ever reach that point, because you have the square cube law working for you. The bigger the ship, proportionally the greater the volume you have, and if you have the greater volume you can fit a bigger power plant in there. And now if you're hand waving away all the other considerations, then that becomes definitely viable, because with draft considerations you may end up being able to build a ship that's so large that you can put as big a power plant as you like in it, but the propellers or azimuth pods or whatever you want to use that are necessary to get the thing moving might actually be so large that their total diameter exceeds the draft of the ship, at which point you have significant problems. Although I suppose today with podded thrusters you could just have them all down the side of the ship and hope for the best. But yeah, propulsion and power isn't going to be your main issue. Now, I don't know exactly how big you can go. You can look at something like the many named biggest ship in the world by length and deadweight, which is variously Seawise Giant or Yara Viking or Happy Giant or whatever you want to call it, at whatever stage in life it was. But that thing is, I suppose in some ways it illustrates the difference between warships and merchant vessels, because if you look at it in a scale with other ships, it is well over twice the dimensions of an Iowa class battleship, but only when it's empty, only about maybe 20 to 30% more displacement, despite it being so much larger in volume. But that's because it's basically the closest thing you can get to an empty box with engines in it, as opposed to, the guns and the armour, etc. you find on an Iowa class. And then you fill it up with oil, and suddenly it becomes hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons displacement. So I think the engineering limit of where you could build, how big you could construct a vessel, would run into two things. One would be, where do you draw the limit in terms of what are you calling a ship and what is now basically a floating stationary object, aka HMS Habakkuk on steroids. But if you're going with a ship that must be made of metal rather than, mostly ice, then the limit you're going to hit, I think, is going to be the structural limit of steel, i.e., at what point have you created a ship that is so large that the lateral and longitudinal forces on it are great enough to just tear the ship in two in rough weather, regardless of how much cross-bracing, etc. you put into it. That is basically going to be the upper limit on size of ship, and anything up to that point you could theoretically build. Now, obviously, there will be a grey area from that, physical upper limits of steel heading downwards, because, of course, if you get it to move, the faster you move, the more force is exerted on the ship, which is going to pre-stress the loads on the ship, which means that in rough seas, a ship that's moving can withstand theoretically less force than a barge, essentially, that is stationary. So the structural limit of steel at your design speed, plus a safety factor, would be the ultimate limit. But exactly how large that is, it depends what you're making it out of. if you're making it out of regular steel, high tension steel, some kind of special steel alloy that we haven't yet quite invented. What kind of reinforcements are you putting in, and are you making it a ship in terms of it can carry something, whether that be weaponry or cargo, or are you making it a ship in terms of a massively complex grid of frameworks and reinforcements surrounded by a watertight skin, which you could make considerably larger than something that actually had to have void spaces in it. Phil Kreider asks, why wasn't it Roosevelt's or Nimitz's fault that Halsey went chasing north rather than staying home and guarding the San Bernardino Strait? I saw a video of the panel at the Naval Institute Press. One of the commenters mentioned that Nimitz's son gave an oral history asking about the line inserted into the orders to destroy the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose, and when Nimitz admitted to adding that line, then Halsey's son said something like, well, then it's your fault, and I happen to agree. Now, I would disagree, actually, there, because, yes, he does have orders to destroy the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arises, but the Japanese fleet is present in multiple locations. So, actually, Ozawa's decoy force, which would lead to the Battle of Cape Engano, is the last of the three forces to be detected. Now, the southern force that is going via Surigao Strait, that, of course, will be Admiral Kinkaid's problem to deal with. But you have Kurita's centre force. Now, okay, you've attacked it at Sibuyan Sea, and you've sunk Musashi. And Kurita turned about to withdraw from the face of American air power. But Halsey then seems to have just turned around and concluded, right, okay, therefore, having managed to sink a single battleship out, and bear in mind at this point, Kurita still has Yamato, Nagato, and the two Congos. He just thinks Kurita's just going to, run away? And then when the reports about Ozawa's force eventually come in, he just takes everything and goes charging off after Ozawa. Now, withdrawal in the face of enemy air power when you can't really contest it during the day wasn't exactly a novel tactic. The Japanese had used it before. The Americans had used it. Withdrawal in the face of potential overwhelming enemy threat. They'd used it at Midway, for example, when they thought the Japanese might come in for a surface action. It had been used a couple of times at Guadalcanal. So the idea that Kurita's force, having suffered major heavy air attack and lost a battleship, when it turns around that this is somehow a permanent withdrawal rather than just a temporary one, that doesn't really add up. And then, of course, during the night, you have reports from recon aircraft that not only say Kurita's force has actually turned back around again, but also the infamous report that the San Bernardino Strait navigation lights have come on, indicating something's going to come through. Now, all of those things indicate that, even just from basic tactical supposition and then the later reports, they all indicate that Kurita's force is coming back, and Kurita's force does amount to a substantial part of the enemy fleet. It's not like Ozawa's force is the only element of the Japanese fleet that's around. Plus, of course, of the two, given the positioning of Halsey's forces the previous day, Kurita's force is the one that is much closer and more able to get to the landing forces. Even if Ozawa's force was fully stocked with strike aircraft, in order for them to come after the landing forces, they would have to come over and therefore through the combat air patrol of 3rd Fleet, which means that at that point, Kurita's centre force is the greater threat, because, as I said, centre force can get to the landing forces much, much faster, and doesn't require flying over 3rd Fleet in order to deal with them. At which point, a sensible officer would have gone, right, okay, I have orders to destroy the Japanese fleet. I'm confronted with 3 Japanese fleets. Intelligence by midnight is telling me that all 3 fleets are coming in. I know the southern force is going to be dealt with by 7th Fleet and Admiral Kinkaid. I have 2 other fleets to deal with. Admiral Lee is telling me we probably should get back to the centre force. The centre force, to be fair, is probably the one that can do the most damage. So I should then go and destroy centre force, and that's destroying a Japanese fleet. And if this other force comes in after me, then I'll take that out as well as and when it comes in. Because the other thing, of course, to remember is that with Admiral Lee's battleships, you have enough surface forces to straight up fight Kurita's force in a gun action. You can obviously send off your strike aircraft to support that action, but you don't need your Helldivers and your Avengers to take on enemy carrier aircraft. And you've just proven by sinking Musashi that you don't need fighter cover, because the Japanese center force doesn't have fighter cover, which means that if you are really, really worried, if you really think Ozawa's carriers have fully loaded flight decks, then you can have every single fighter in Third Fleet on combat air patrol and watching for them, and then you can chew up any incoming Japanese strike whilst your aircraft and Lee's battleships deal with Kurita's force. And then, as and when those strike aircraft return, you can then go after Ozawa's carriers, who now presumably will be completely defenseless because you've just chewed up their entire air group. So that would be the reasonable and rational thing to do, I think, at least, and is fully in line with the orders from Nimitz to destroy the Japanese fleet if the opportunity arose. Ignoring the intelligence about what Kurita's force was doing and just assuming that it had just run away before the glorious American aircraft, and then just go charging off completely separately after Ozawa's forces, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense when approached from a rational tactical perspective, to be perfectly honest. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, in hindsight, would Japan have been better off building the Yamatos as Shinanos or some other similar ground-up design instead of the battleships they ended up as, or would they still have ended up as floating hotels? I think the answer probably comes down to how many more pilots can the Japanese train in the run-up to World War II. Because, as I've mentioned in Drydock Answers and hinted at in the 5-minute guide to Shinano, if she'd been completed as a full-fledged armoured deck fleet carrier, then she could have an air group well north of 100 aircraft. Or, with operational constraints in actually operating that kind of air group, she could have had an operational air group of 90 to 100 aircraft, with kind of 50% of that, 50% in addition to that as spare aircraft, so presumably with some extra pilots as well, which would give her great resiliency in a multi-day carrier battle, because you could send out your air group, it might take casualties, but then when it comes back, you wind down some of your spare aircraft, damaged aircraft can be repaired or jettisoned, the pilots reassigned to new aircraft, and where you've lost both pilot and plane, you just assign one of your reserve pilots to a new plane as well. And then you can strike the next day with a full-strength air group, whereas your opponent, in theory, will be down considerably. Now, in that circumstance, though, that means you're going to need at least 120, 130 fully trained pilots for each of your two conversions, in addition to Shinano, so Yamato and Musashi. So you would need a core of minimum 240 to 250 trained pilots, or to be more correct, because of course things like Vals and Kates have multiple people in them, trained crews. So once you take into account the strike aircraft crews, you're probably talking somewhere north of 400 to 500 additional trained aircrew, and that's just the minimum. That allows for no reserve ashore or whatever. Now, if the Japanese carrier pilot and aircrew training program can be expanded or accelerated to generate the additional, probably allowing for reserves and so forth, maybe 600 to 800 flight crew that you need, the majority of which will be pilots, then it would make sense to get the Yamatos built from near enough the ground up, basically as kind of Lexington or Akagi style conversions. Because your fleet speed's not going to be too badly affected. You've already got Kaga slowing you down. And then you'd have very, very powerful, very durable carriers able to launch huge amounts of aircraft, which would be a massive advantage in Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, whatever else. And of course, by sheer numbers, there's more of a chance that you will be able to destroy your enemy before they can completely chew over your own air groups. So it's not just the case of having the additional hulls and the additional pilots, it's also the attrition of the Japanese Naval Air Corps will probably not be quite as bad. But that is a big ask. And if the Japanese can't generate that many additional aircraft and that many additional aircrew in time to effectively use them, which will be 42, 43, then you're probably just better off having the Yamatos as battleships, because if you can't use them effectively as carriers, there's not really a huge point in having them. Albeit that said, especially with hindsight, and perhaps also at the time, there were also much, much better ways you could have utilised the Yamatos. Admittedly, it would be a higher risk, high reward strategy, but again, especially using hindsight, if you'd thrown say at least one of the Yamatos into Guadalcanal, that might have had a fairly significant effect on that campaign. And even if you did end up losing one of the Yamatos at Guadalcanal whilst accomplishing something, well, it's not like Musashi ever accomplished all that much of anything. Yamato at least made it through to the Battle of Samar, but whether Musashi goes down towards the end of the Guadalcanal campaign or during the Battle of Sibian Sea doesn't really make an awful lot of odds. Guz Riesbos asks, during the Age of Sail, what percentage of crew could be expected to have their ankles broken by loose rolling cannonballs and other heavy equipment during a battle? And what could be done to prevent injuries, apart from yelling "fore" when one got loose and wearing a bunch of shin braces? You'd be surprised, actually, not that many casualties were recorded from people having their feet run over by random shot. For one thing, the majority of shot was stored deep in the bowels of the ship, and the shot that was available on deck, well, obviously you've got to contend with storms and otherwise high seas, etc., etc. So the idea of, not wanting a 24 or 32 or 18-pounder cannonball rolling around the deck and mashing everybody's ankles was fairly high on people's list of priorities, and they had a fair amount of time to get used to how to secure the things against exactly this kind of thing happening. So when whatever shot was available on the various gun decks was around, it would be very well secured, and only the worst of weather conditions would really dislodge it. And if the ship saw that it was heading into really bad weather, probably even that ammunition might very well be sent down below, not only to avoid the risk of it running around the decks, but also because if you're in really bad weather, then the more heavy weight there you have at the bottom of the ship, the better your stability, which is obviously good for riding out the storms. Now, at times it's possible that cannonballs would come loose, etc., but if you're in weather conditions where that is going to happen, by the time your cannonballs are coming loose, there's probably an awful lot more, and that's a lot more dangerous, that's coming loose, like guns and bits of cutlery and so forth. At which point you're probably going to have some people trying to secure the heavy stuff, but everyone else is going to be probably on the upper decks making sure that the sails don't blow out and the masts don't go over, and so on and so forth. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen entirely. Obviously, the accidents will happen. The sheer number of ships, the sheer number of men, and the sheer number of cannonballs are going to dictate that eventually it's going to happen on a semi-regular basis somewhere in the world. But it would be a more unusual injury, I think. Now, as far as what can be done to prevent those injuries, well, the main thing, prevention is better than cure. So, you secure your guns, you secure your cannon shot as much as humanly possible. If something like that gets free, however, there's very little you can do. If a cannon gets free, well, actually, to be honest, the procedure for a cannon or a large cannonball is pretty much the same. You don't try and stop it while it's moving. You would wait until either it's hit something relatively solid, whatever that might happen to be, or if it's moving around because the ship's rolling or pitching, you would wait till that roll or pitch puts it in a position where it doesn't move. So with a cannon, if it rolls back, well, then when the ship rolls the other way, it's going to theoretically roll back roughly in the direction it went. So when that cannon fetches up against the hull of the ship, or against a mast, or against a ridge of some kind in the deck, that's when you grab it and then try and stop it from picking up momentum again. And similarly with a cannonball, you dance out the way of the thing, and when either the ship's roll briefly arrests its momentum, or when it wedges itself into something or props itself up against something, i.e. when it's basically stationary, that's when you pick it up to stop it doing anything further. Ariel Time Shrine asks, what could the US Navy have done to their interwar cruiser format of situating floatplane facilities amidships to avoid the kinds of devastating fire damage seen in the Battle of Savo Island? Given that said facilities would be unreasonable to armour to any significant degree, as stipulated by treaty restrictions, why was this even taken as an option when shells are more likely to land amidships than at the stern? So the reason for the amidships hangars is that, at least on cruiser-sized vessels, and actually to be honest on battleship-sized vessels as well, the amidships position is somewhat better for launching and recovering aircraft than the astern position. Now, there are certain other advantages beyond the lack of fire hazards to the astern position of aircraft, but durability, all-weather operation, etc., it works better amidships. Plus, you've got to remember that as cruisers, the New Orleans class designed in the interwar were designed to carry a lot of aircraft, at which point having a large hangar amidships where the beam is at its widest is better than at the stern, where, especially for a cruiser, there's a very, very narrow beam. You're not going to get a hangar on the back there. On battleships, obviously, with a much greater beam, storing aircraft back there is a slightly different matter. So there are some decent operational reasons for carrying aircraft amidships. Now, as far as reducing the fire hazard aspects of things, there's a few different things you could do. One, you can have fewer aircraft, which probably should have started to become self-evident. I mean, you look at a lot of ships that are designed to carry 4, 5, 6, maybe, or even 3 aircraft, and realistically speaking, during wartime, they don't tend to use anywhere near as many. Usually only using 1, maybe 2, and therefore if you only need kind of 1 spare, perhaps, at which point 2 to 3 aircraft, and maybe 3 on larger ships and 2 on smaller ships, is probably better. So reducing the number of aircraft, that would reduce the fire risk. The other thing you could do is to draw, kind of like what they learned on aircraft carriers after Lexington at Coral Sea, you could draw down flammable stuff like aviation fuel, etc., and paint deep into the ship and keep it there unless you're conducting flight operations. The problem is, of course, if you're a cruiser and you're conducting semi-regular flight operations, that would add another burden to the crew of, okay, flight operations are over, take everything down, but then when you have to resume flight operations, which might be a few hours, it might be the next day, then you have to bring everything back up again, and so on and so forth. So you can see how that would probably not be a habit the crew would really get into all that much. Plus, of course, the aircraft themselves are somewhat flammable, and their tanks are going to have at least some fuel in them, so you can't completely eliminate the fire hazard anyway amidships. That's not to say you couldn't have, as I said, it's not to say you couldn't have done more, but there was a lot of pressure on operations, and some things are just going to be further down the line. Now, if, for example, you told those cruisers ahead of time you are going to be in a surface gun action, then the aircraft might well have been flown off and more effort to secure and store things away might have been done. But of course, part of the whole thing with the first Battle of Savo Island was they weren't expecting it. And so things weren't necessarily quite as fully rigged for battle as they might otherwise have been. And this is your classic catch-22 of any aircraft operating cruiser of, do you maintain absolute strict readiness for action at any possible time during war, which is the ideal state, but that imposes a huge amount of additional stress and work on your crew, and that means in turn your crew may not be as combat capable when it comes to the actual fighting. So where is the trade-off? And when you make that trade-off, occasionally, because the enemy gets a vote as well, it doesn't work out for you quite so well. Andrew Dederer asks, given the pressure that the treaty era put on guarding the Empire, leading the Royal Navy to try and convince everyone else to design smaller cruisers so that they could afford what they needed, did the Royal Navy look into using aircraft to take up the slack? The US was experimented with rigid airship scouts and B-17s for coast defence, while the Japanese built up several wings of G3 and G4 maritime patrol bombers and some impressive flying boats to scout for them. Granted, neither of them worked as intended, but did Britain have something similar planned, or did the Air Force-Navy feud prevent it from ever being considered? They occasionally would look into things, but part of it was the Fleet Air Arm had come under the control of the RAF, and basically anything aircraft related had come under control of the RAF, which meant that what long-range maritime patrol aircraft did exist, mostly in the form of flying boats, were purely under Royal Air Force control. Now, they did also briefly think about, at least there are some papers talking about the use of airships, but, well, as you can tell, this is R101. Didn't exactly work out, did it? But even that aside, the Royal Navy and the British Empire as a whole really faced some unique problems that the other two big powers didn't. Now, as you said, the Japanese had some pretty nice maritime patrol bombers and flying boats, etc. But the Japanese were effectively operating from almost, not quite, but almost a point source. You know, they had Japan and the immediate ancillary holdings. And so a Japanese G3 or G4 bomber force that was based in Japan could, in relatively short order, redeploy to pretty much anywhere that the Japanese held. And as we saw in the opening stages of the Japanese campaign, the groups that, you know, put down barely 24 hours before they went and sunk Fort Z, they moved down there in pretty short order from the moment the Japanese started their advances. And the Americans, whilst they have a few places like Pearl Harbor and Midway and Wake and so forth, again largely are looking at the continental United States, and therefore, you know, an aircraft that's patrolling off the coast of Boston one day can a couple of days later be patrolling over the Gulf, the Caribbean, and a few days after that it can be going up and down the west coast. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, has a worldwide scattered empire to defend. So aircraft that are defending the UK really aren't going to be in a position to go and defend India anytime soon. And the aircraft in India aren't going to be able to defend South Africa. The ones in South Africa aren't going to be able to defend Australia. And the ones in Australia can't defend Canada, etc., etc., etc. Which means that if you are going to try and use aircraft or airships, you're going to need large numbers of them at each one of those and many other locations in order to have anything approaching an effective force for recon, which is going to be massively expensive. And of course, during the majority of the interwar period, recon is really all they're good for. It's actually not really until the end of the 1930s that the strike capability of any reasonably small number of aircraft becomes enough that you can actually reliably use them to hit enemy targets. And then you also have the range issues. Even in the late 1930s, aircraft can't go, if they're fully war-loaded with torpedoes and stuff, they can't go out too far, they can't stay out too long. Flying at night is a big problem, so protecting convoys, which are, you know, going to be present night and day for long periods of time and are often going to be in the deep ocean where these aircraft can't reach, that's going to need cruisers. And if you're going to have cruisers to escort the convoys in those situations, well, the cruisers have to get to and from shore to refuel just as much as the ships do, at which point they're going to be protecting the convoys the whole way through. And if you're going to need an awful lot of cruisers or even more aircraft, and it's both going to cost a fantastic amount of money, the cruiser offers actually the better option, because the cruiser can be around all the time, it can sink enemy targets, hopefully most of them that come after the convoys, and the cruisers can then also be taken off and used elsewhere on the front lines as battle units, whereas aircraft can't really. Shore-based aircraft, of course, do occasionally try and interfere with naval warfare, but it's outside of a few things like Force said, it's not usually ending too well for them. And you also have to account for the fact that, even if aircraft are everything that Billy Mitchell dreamed they could be, they can only be out there, again, for a certain amount of time. So if you think the great grand battle with the enemy fleet is going to be on, I don't know, the afternoon of the 17th of February, and all your aircraft assemble over your fleet ready for that, and the enemy fleet doesn't show up, and your aircraft go away, and then the enemy fleet shows up that night or the following morning, and you've sacrificed your cruiser screen, or most of it, in exchange for having lots and lots of aircraft, now you're in a lot of trouble. And it's going to take too long for those aircraft to come back to help you. So when you're talking on the scale of a worldwide empire with the technology that's available in the interwar period, cruisers just add up to just being better at the job than arbitrarily large numbers of aircraft, which you can't afford anyway. And plus, of course, cruisers tend to take years or decades to become obsolete. Aircraft at that point were becoming obsolete every 4 or 5 years. Dave Collier asks, what's your favourite examples of Royal Navy Jack speak, and what are the names of the equivalent secret languages in other navies? I don't know exactly what the equivalent of Jack speak is in other navies, to be perfectly honest. Maybe those of you who serve in those other navies or have done can chime in. What's the local name for the various sayings and shorthands and so forth that you come up with? Now, as far as my favourite examples of Jack speak, well, that runs into the slight problem that an awful lot of Jack speak is either itself unrepeatable or alludes to things that are unrepeatable, because let's face it, it is the Navy. But in everyday speech, my favourite examples of Jack speak tend to be some of the ones that have been adopted into general usage, or are present enough within the general cultural knowledge that people get the rough idea about what you're saying, even if they don't strictly understand where it comes from, or they don't absolutely understand what you're saying. They just get the general drift. Partly because using it can make you feel a little bit more nautical themed, which is quite fun, and also because they've been around in the English language for a relatively long time and there's a certain purpose to them. They also tend to make you sound a little bit more, I wouldn't necessarily say wise, a bit more cynical and kind of watching the world go by with a gimlet eye kind of thing, which is an attitude I try to maintain. But yeah, I mean, some very common ones that in the English language would be, if you say, oh, well, but he's all adrift, that's Jack speak. Run that up the mast or the lines and see who salutes is perhaps a less used one, but one I do occasionally use in day-to-day conversation. And I actually find that's actually quite a fun one, because it sounds vaguely educated and you get the general drift of what you're saying, but a lot of people in day-to-day life don't really strictly understand exactly what you're saying. And if you put it in exactly the right tone of voice and context as well, you can basically tell someone, well, that's a absolutely awful idea that nobody is actually ever going to go for, but you go for it and I'm just going to watch it all come crashing down around your ears. But of course, if you said that in a public environment, people would start being offended and hurt feelings. Whereas if you can imagine Drac a few years ago sitting in yet another council meeting, listening to yet another terrible idea going on in the local authority, and they're looking for you for approval or comment, and you just sit back and go, well, run that one up the flagpole, see who salutes. With a sort of a cynical grin on your face. You get the point over exactly without anyone being able to pin you down for potentially being offensive. For someone who knows what nautical terminology actually means, using the phrase "taken aback" actually, I think, has a lot more impact, because taken aback, people are like, oh, okay, he was a bit shocked or surprised. Whereas if you think about a Age of Sail ship of the line that's been taken aback by a sudden shift in wind, it's actually a lot more impactful. So I do like that one. And I suppose the other one that I'll mention here is true colours, because, of course, if you say, someone's shown their true colours, you are essentially meaning, right, they were hiding what they were before and now they've revealed it. Whereas, obviously, most of you will know just exactly what navies think of vessels that sail under true colours, and especially sailors who engage in combat under false colours. You know, it's a lot more serious an accusation. So if you say, so someone's showing their true colours, and you know the origin of the phrase, you're implying an awful lot more about their character and their actions than it perhaps appears to be on a surface level. And I think that's one of the joys of using Jack speak generally. Obviously, these are some of the older ones, but also some of the newer ones in the sort of the wider civilian world, is that people might understand the gist of what you're saying, and so you get your point across, sometimes as illustrated, without actually having to slap them in the face with how stupid they're being. But also, for you yourself, you understand that actually what you're saying is considerably more powerful, more strong language than the person at the receiving end might otherwise appear, which allows you to express some of your frustrations without getting into too much trouble. Mike Lima 777 asks, originally there were 8 ships of the Kent subclass of the County class heavy cruisers planned, but only 5 of these were ordered, along with 2 more for the Royal Australian Navy, and there was also to be a 5th member of the Norfolk subclass that never received a name. What might have been the names of these ships, the 3 Kents and 1 Norfolk, and would the 5th Norfolk have been built as such, or would it have also been altered to the plan design for Surrey and Northumberland? I think if the 5th unnamed Norfolk had been built, it almost certainly would have been built to the same design as Surrey and Northumberland. In terms of names, well, you've got all the English counties to choose from, so you can perhaps draw some ideas or inspiration, not just from looking at the English county list, but perhaps from looking at the previous and subsequent county classes. So what's otherwise known as the Monmouth class are also sometimes called the county class because they follow the same naming convention but in World War One. And then you also have the county class destroyers in the Cold War. Now, with the county class in the Cold War, you can compare and contrast with the counties that were built in the interwar period. So we have Devonshire. Well, Devonshire does have a corresponding interwar one, as does Kent and London, as does Norfolk, but Hampshire, Fife, Glamorgan and Antrim, they don't have equivalents in the interwar classes, of which Hampshire almost certainly would be used. Fife, Glamorgan and Antrim might end up being used, but probably less likely than Hampshire. And then when you look at the Monmouth in World War One, you've got Monmouth herself, probably wouldn't be used because of the loss of Monmouth in World War One. You've got Bedford and Essex, so those would potentially be candidates. And given that you've got Kent in there already, and Sussex, Essex will probably be a shoe-in. Berwick has a corresponding Kent subclass, as does Cornwall and Cumberland. But Donegal and Lancaster don't. So, given the propensity of the Royal Navy to pick ship names that have been used a number of times, I suspect Essex, Hampshire and Lancaster would definitely be shoe-ins, at which point something like Donegal or Antrim or something like that might very well be another one that would come in. So those would probably be my initial thoughts for the unnamed vessels. Michael Imbezi asks, I've noticed that in War Thunder you can really degrade a ship's capability by spamming it with large caliber HE shells from far away to set fires, knock out the secondary battery, and damage things like radar and rangefinders that aren't particularly well armoured. Would this have actually been a viable tactic in the Second World War, and if so, was it ever used? In theory, yes, it should work, because you can disable a ship's ability to fight by knocking out all of these systems, radar, rangefinders, set things on fire, etc., etc. And that would then enable you to close in and finish the ship off at your leisure with armor-piercing shells or torpedoes. In some ways, it's a larger caliber version of the hail of fire doctrine that pre-dreadnoughts were built around. However, it does run into a few issues. Firstly is the fact that people expect some of their systems to be knocked out, so they have lots of backups. So just because your HE shell completely demolishes the upper part of the superstructure and takes the main rangefinder away, well, there's going to be a bunch of others that can take over, in theory. Secondly is that HE shells, unlike in games, have completely different ballistic properties and often shorter ranges than armor-piercing shells. So computing the range for all of that, and you're going to have a shorter range, it's going to be somewhat harder to hit, etc., etc. Your opponent, if you're loaded with HE and your opponent's loaded with AP and you're engaging in a long-range gun duel, your opponent may be able to just outshoot you at a range that you can't respond at. And you've also got the problem that, yes, you're potentially crippling the ship, but an armor-piercing shell that hits in roughly the same vicinity, it has explosive on board, and it may very well do similar levels of damage. Out in the open, as opposed to in an enclosed area, the explosive power of a shell diminishes rather rapidly. So even though an HE shell contains a lot more explosive than an AP shell does, if that AP shell hits and detonates, the effective blast radius for damaging or destroying things that are reasonably robust, like radars on rangefinders and your secondary battery, etc., the ultimate damage radius of an HE shell is not going to be that much greater than an AP shell. Again, assuming it detonates, of course, and direct hit with an AP shell will destroy it anyway. But obviously the one thing an HE shell can't do is the vital hits that can cripple or destroy an enemy ship outright very, very quickly. So, if you fire, let's say, one of the most accurate salvos in history. So let's say you have an 8-gun ship. You fire your salvo and 4 shells hit at extremely long range. So you're hyper accurate. And let's say one of those shells hits the upper part of the forward superstructure. Okay, that's probably going to do a bit more damage than the AP shell that might have just punched a hole through the area. So you've potentially limited the ship's ability to use its main rangefinder, for example, a bit more. Let's say your next shell lands somewhere in the superstructure or upper part of the ship amidships. Okay, again, the blast effect setting fire of an HE shell is going to be more detrimental than the AP shell would have been, which would have maybe just skipped through a few decks, exited out the other side, and then blown up in the sea. But then let's take your next 2 shells. Let's say one shell slams into a turret. Now, okay, a 15 or 16-inch armor-piercing shell slamming into a turret, HE shell slamming into a turret and exploding isn't necessarily going to do brilliant things, but the chances are the turret and the crew inside are probably going to survive. So after a short period of picking themselves back up off the deck, at worst, they will probably just have the turret back in action. Whereas an AP shell in that same scenario might very well have disabled that turret entirely. And then your last shell, let's say that hits pretty much at the waterline on the main armor belt. Well, at that point, the HE shell, when it explodes, at worst is going to poke a few shrapnel holes in the less armored portions of the ship's hull nearby, and they'll feel a slight judder. And if you're really, really lucky, let's say it's a 16 or 18-inch HE shell, and your opponent isn't especially well armored by capital ship standards, then it might force some leaks by forcing a plate back or something. But if that was an AP shell, there is a chance that AP shell may have gone straight through the armor plate, deep into the magazines or the engine rooms or whatever, and exploded. And even if it didn't hit the magazines or the engine rooms, it's exploded inside, it's done a bunch of damage to stuff that's inside, and it's opened up a path of flooding much deeper into the ship than the HE shell ever was going to. Now, multiply that across if your opponent is firing AP at you and you're firing HE at them, then assuming that you're both landing hits at roughly the same time, you might be degrading their fighting capability a little bit more up top, but they're much more likely to have just flat out crippled you or possibly destroyed you in that same exchange of fire. hence why they use AP. Now, that's not to say that smothering someone in HE isn't a viable tactic. It can be, especially if you don't have the armor-piercing capability of really dealing significant damage to your opponent. But if you're going like for like, you might as well use the AP, because if you want to put it in game terms, the AP grants you a significantly greater chance of a critical hit. An HE shell is very unlikely to do so, even if its individual damage per hit on unarmoured areas is going to be a little bit higher. Aaron Ford asks, has anyone attempted to make a decoy capital ship to draw attention from aircraft? Yes, definitely. Here's some examples. What do you see here? You would theoretically be seeing 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier. How many actual warships are there present in this picture? Well, none, unless that one right at the very top corner is. The 3 capital ships you're seeing here are merchant ships that have all been done up to look like HMS Hermes and a pair of Revenge-class battleships. They're actually just merchant hulls. And this was a thing that the Royal Navy did in World War II at Scapa Flow to distract German aircraft. You also had HMS Centurion, which of course was a World War I era 13.5-inch ship that was dressed up to cosplay as HMS Anson, a King George V class battleship, which to provide further distraction. So yes, this was done, and on a relatively extensive scale as well in some periods. Elsewhere in the world it was slightly less common, but that was largely because US fleet bases were generally not at so much risk of being regularly overflown by enemy recon aircraft. Japanese fleet bases, well, by the time the US was able to overfly mainland Japan with recon aircraft, the Japanese had better things to do with their resources than construct entire fake battle fleets, although they did occasionally try the odd decoy. And the Germans and the Italians similarly a little bit strapped for resources. And also, this is the other thing when it comes to decoys, you have to have a certain number of ships for decoys to be effective, because if you've got over a dozen capital ships, and some of them might be at sea at any given moment, and some of them are going to be in port, well, then if your recon flight shows 3 or 4 of them in port, then you might think, that seems reasonable, that seems fair. So if they've got a dozen active capital ships and we've seen 4 of them in port, that means there's 8 out at sea. Okay, we'll make our planning in accordance with that, when in fact all 12 might be out at sea. But you don't know that, but there's a reasonable supposition for you to think that something's going on that isn't, or isn't going on that is. Whereas if you're the Germans, and at any given point you only have 2 or 3 active capital ships, and the Royal Navy goes, or the RAF goes, our recon efforts show 5. 1 or 2 of these things are not like the others, and then they're going to start looking into it in even more detail, which is exactly what you don't want. Which is why you have things like turpits being painted up to look like a brick building, rather than trying to construct an entire fake turpits. TXK234 asks, seaplane tenders-carriers are generally overshadowed by the artillery duels of the First World War and only play a minor role in World War II. Can you briefly go over notable moments of seaplane carriers and maybe give us a resource for further reading? So in terms of a good book to read up on for this kind of thing, I would strongly suggest Naval Aviation in the First World War by R.D. Lehman, or more properly, Naval Aviation in the First World War, Its Impact and Influence, if you can get a hold of a copy. One was available in the big book sale I did a little bit earlier, and so somebody's got that, and if you can find another copy and have a look, it's a pretty good reference. There's some available on Abe Books, some copies for they're pretty cheap. They're sort of £3 to £5, at least on the UK version of the site. Now, obviously, that will cover all naval aviation in the First World War, but you'll tend to find that the vast majority of naval aviation in the First World War was done by seaplane tenders or carriers of some description. Seaplane tenders generally don't feature all that much in World War II. They are around, certainly, but they don't have quite the same levels of firsts and interesting exploits as perhaps the ones in the First World War do. So focusing mostly on the First World War, you've obviously got the various raids on German installations, especially Zeppelin sheds. They're all done by seaplane carrier. You've got HMS Ark Royal, the first one, which you can see here. That did a bunch of operations, especially in the Mediterranean. You've got Engadine and Campania, which were both seaplane tenders that went out with the Grand Fleet to Jutland. Campania, leaving late, didn't quite make it before she was ordered to turn back. And of course, Engadine launched an aircraft which was able to observe the battle and potentially could have given Jellicoe vital strategic information, except that he wasn't able to actually communicate that to Jellicoe thanks to some rather imperfect and in some cases broken systems of communication. But there you go. What can you do? But that's certainly interesting to read about. You've got the Japanese seaplane carrier Wakamiya, which technically conducts the first naval airstrike ever over in the Pacific. So yeah, there's quite a few different exploits of seaplane carriers that are interesting to read about. And of course, there's also the potential that the seaplane carriers might have been in attendance in some way, shape or form in the never launched Great 1919 planned torpedo strike on the German high seas fleet. Jeffrey Connolly asks, Admiral Drac is put in charge of building a 5-strong battlecruiser class that is the best of both the Renown and Admiral class. What would you name them, and what kind of career could you see them having in World War II? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Because, well, if I'm in charge, I'm going into my triple turret all-forward universe immediately. So, welcome, everybody, to Drac's idea of what Battlecruiser 1917-18 should be. And yes, it is pretty much a 1515 Nelson-style layout, but on a battlecruiser hull, so why all the components look a lot more like Hood, with clustered secondary battery aft, and anti-aircraft guns in the middle. And efficiency-wise, this means I can actually get the thing up to 14 inches of armour whilst maintaining my 32 knot speed, and of course I have an extra gun than Hood, so I'm very, very happy with it. And it comes in at displacing slightly less than Hood as well, which is quite helpful. So that's what I would propose building, because it's just hilarious and stupidly powerful. Now, what would I name them? That's an interesting one, because in theory at this point the Renowns and the Admirals have both been done, so I can't use those names. So I'd use a bunch of names that have been used in pre-dreadnoughts and ironclads, so collectively the 5 ships would be Conqueror, Thunderer, Devastation, Vengeance and Triumph. And I'll leave it to you to decide which of those becomes the class name. As for World War II careers, well, they're 9 15-inch gun-fast battleships. So, you know, refit the engines when they wear out. You've got a lovely great back deck there for massive amounts of anti-aircraft guns. You can fit small things like pom-poms down the sides. I think you're pretty much going to end up with maybe 2 in the home fleet and 3 in the Mediterranean. And they're going to have a lot of fun chasing everything. Sea Dodders asks, we've heard speculated armaments for the cancelled Queen Elizabeth class battleship Agincourt, mainly in the realm of either 1515s or possibly twin 18s. I seem to recall some speculation about retrofitting 1515s to the rest of the QE class as well, which gets very interesting if the Royal Navy develops the 15-inch 50. Would this have been possible? Were the barbettes of the Queen Elizabeth class unusually wide? I understand that widening existing barbettes is a task that usually makes you consider just building an entirely new ship, as it's probably easier and cheaper. If the turrets could be retrofitted, could other ships such as the Renowns or Hood be fitted thus? Now, my normal instinct would be to say that probably not. However, on closer inspection, if you compare like with like, for example, the 15-inch 42 twin turret, which you can see here, that has an inner barbette diameter of 30.5 feet. Okay, so what, you might ask? Well, the triple turret of the US Navy for the 14-inch gun. Granted, it's an inch less, but the triple turrets, depending on which battleship you're looking at, because obviously you've got 14-inch 45s and 14-inch 50s, but they're around 29 to 30 feet on their inner barbette diameter, which means that, broadly speaking, the US Navy is able to fit 3 14-inch guns into a barbette whose inner diameter is actually between 6 inches and 1.5 feet less than the barbette diameter of, or the inner barbette diameter of, these 15-inch twin turrets. And then you look at this profile and you think, well, if I space the guns out a little bit, I mean, obviously the turrets themselves have these kind of sloping sides, so there's not as much internal volume. But, you know, if I squared up these turrets and maybe gave the turrets themselves a little bit of overhang over the barbettes and then opened up these two guns a little bit so that they were maybe at the 1/3 and 1/3 points along the width of the barbette, and then I could possibly slot a third gun in the middle. I mean, it might physically work. The turrets would be somewhat oversized and would overhang the barbettes as opposed to sitting on top of them like they do here. That's not necessarily entirely out of the question when it comes to, you know, turrets of this period anyway, though. I suspect the turrets would still be somewhat cramped, even if you did like fully box them up instead of going in with these sloping walls and faces. But it might be physically possible. Now, of course, that's not the end to it. You've also got to completely redo the entire hoist system and presumably enhance magazine capacity as well, because you're now feeding 50% more guns from the same number of shells and charges. But believe it or not, I think you might be able to pull it off. You would have problems, though, I think. Not just in the weight, which we'll come to in a minute, but obviously the US Navy had issues with their 14-inch triples and the guns being a bit too close together and causing all sorts of dispersion issues, which they eventually fixed with delay circuits and so forth. But I suspect trying to retrofit some kind of triple 15 onto this barbette diameter probably would run into the same kinds of issues. But assuming that you can get the hoists, etc. to work, I mean, it's going to be hilariously expensive, but it could be done. The biggest issue, though, you're going to face once you've resolved the dispersion issues is going to be that you've increased the overall armament of the ship by 50%, from 8 guns to 12 guns. The turrets are obviously going to be bigger. They're going to weigh more. The additional 4 guns also weighs more. That's a lot of additional top weight. So you're going to have to do something fairly drastic to keep the ships from becoming dangerously unstable. Now, you could do what they did with the modernizations in the 1930s and basically bulge the ships out below the waterline, but that may have interesting implications further down the line, because if you've already bulged the ships out for stability and to counteract some of the additional displacement, then when it comes time to add additional anti-aircraft armament and so forth, you may have a bit of a problem. Which means when you're redoing the superstructure and so forth, you may have to do some rather radical superstructure and secondary battery changes in order to give yourself the necessary stability. But whilst without an extremely detailed engineering examination, I wouldn't want to commit to it 100%, based purely off of dimensions and a little bit of fudge factor, you might just do it. I'm not sure it'll be a brilliant idea, but you could do it. The Judge 2017 asks, did Australia have any dry docks that could be used for the repair of US cruisers and smaller vessels in 1942? And if so, are there any instances of US cruisers going to Australia instead of going back to the mainland United States? And if they did have these facilities but the US never used them, then why not? The answer is yes, such a dry dock did exist, the Sutherland dry dock on Cockatoo Island. Here is USS Portland, circa the Guadalcanal campaign, having repairs done after it sustained damage, and it was preceded into this dock for repairs by USS Chester and USS New Orleans, amongst others. So, yeah, US cruisers did relatively frequently actually use Cockatoo Island's facilities to make repairs. Now, as far as instead of going back to the mainland US, there's a slightly different matter. In the case of these three cruisers, they had different levels of damage. Now, Cockatoo Island was able to fully repair in terms of, patched up, get back out fighting some of the cruisers. Others, like, ones with missing bows, for instance, they could do most of the repairs, but they couldn't rebuild the bow because that was something for a US Navy dock to do. But they did put the temporary stub bow that at least one US cruiser used to get across the Pacific. But generally, once ships had been beaten up this badly, when they went into Australia for repairs, they would be patched up to be, as I said, essentially battle-worthy, unless they'd lost a major portion of themselves. But then they were usually further recalled to the United States for additional repairs, overhauls, and upgrades, which they'd taken the opportunity to perform. So, usually, Cockatoo Island was a stopover for repairs before heading back for the US for other work. But in theory, if you'd needed to get a ship patched up into just being able to float and fight and get back out there, then yes, the Australian yards could do that. Richard Goss asks, can you talk more about the triple 4-inch mounts on the Renowns, Courageous and Hood, and who designed these? Do you think they were designed for whatever Agincourt was? Well, just as a quick note, Hood never actually carried these. As far as I know, it was the Renowns and Courageous, Glorious and Furious. Hood had experimental 5.5-inch guns. In any case, were they designed for what Agincourt was? No, they were designed a bit later. Agincourt, i.e. the never-built final Queen Elizabeth class, if she had been constructed, would have predated the existence of this mount by about 2 years, which is probably would have been for the best, because, to be honest, they're an awful, awful, awful design. Now, there are some interesting redeeming values to them. As you can see here, unlike a lot of secondary batteries, they are individually mounted. So this is a 3-gun mount, not a triple mount, which means if one of them dies, then the other two can continue firing. But that's really where the good news ends. The reason they were designed was because Admiral Fisher didn't like the 6-inch as a secondary gun. He preferred the 4-inch because of its more rapid rate of fire. And when it came to designing the Courageouses and the Renowns, someone came up with the brilliant idea of, well, if each individual shell can't necessarily stop a destroyer, which is what the point of the 6-inch was, then we need as many 4-inch as we can possibly get, which would have been okay if someone had designed a reasonable twin 4-inch mount, but some genius, I don't know exactly who, I haven't looked into it in that much detail, decided that a triple was a brilliant plan, and so we get this thing. As you can tell, there is no power assist to this, so yeah, it is manually moved around, and it weighs a lot, which meant that pretty much the entire gun crew had to help if you wanted to turn this thing, which, given that it's supposed to be a rapid tracking mount to engage destroyers, yeah, that's not going to help. Also basically completely rules it out as an anti-aircraft mount, even though having the 3 guns individually mounted would actually have otherwise, in theory, made it a relatively decent anti-aircraft mount, because instead of having to wait for both of them to be loaded, aimed and fired, you could effectively have 3 single guns in close formation, all firing at the rate that their various gun crews can load, aim and fire the weapons. But, well, to get 3 of these guns in this relatively small mounting, they had a gun crew of around about 2 dozen. And they're not very far apart. So, yeah, trying to get 2 dozen men into this tiny little mount to load all the guns, they just get in each other's way, which meant the rate of fire was very slow. And with everyone so crowded together, you couldn't even fire the guns independently, because if you did, there was a decent chance you might take out a guy from the gun crew next to you, or if you fired the centre gun crews on either side of you. So that certainly didn't help. So yeah, no power, massively oversized gun crew, very heavy, guns far too close together. Yeah, it's just, they're not good at all. To be perfectly honest, you could take the middle gun out and then you'd have a vastly improved mount, because yes, you've theoretically cut your rate of fire by, or your firepower by 1/3, but the remaining 2-gun mount will have 2 nicely spaced guns which can individually fire at will. It'll be much lighter, so it'll be able to move and track quicker, and you've taken out probably 6 to 8 men from the gun crew, so people can actually breathe. So yeah, overall that would be a great improvement, and you'll probably increase your rate of fire so much that you'll be chucking more shells downrange per minute with an adapted 2-gun mount than you would with the slow-firing triple. So yeah, if in the great annals of naval engineering mistakes, this is pretty high up. Tugtrash88 asks, in Drydock episode 220, you mentioned the Japanese Navy didn't really have much of an anti-submarine technology section or doctrine. They must have had advisors with eyes and would have seen submarines' potential against Great Britain in World War I. Since they're also an island nation, why was this the case going into World War II? Was it simply a miscalculation on their part, or did they have the theory or strategy in place and it just didn't work? So there's a huge amount of complexity behind the Japanese failure of anti-submarine doctrine. Now, if you go to the US Navy Institute website, the US Navy Institute press website, usni.org, there's an article, Why Japan's Anti-Submarine Warfare Failed, by Atsushi Oi, and I think that's how it's pronounced anyway, and that's in the proceedings, US Navy proceedings, from June 1952, so relatively soon after World War II concluded. You can read that, and if you sign up for membership, you can read all of the proceedings archives. But nonetheless, the general gist of it is a few different factors. Firstly, yes, the Japanese did see what happened to the British in World War I, but it didn't happen to them. So it made less of an impact on the Japanese Navy. Secondly, culturally, by the time you got to the interwar Japanese Navy, everyone was expected to fight offensively, fight glorious actions straight up in the enemy's face. Long, slow, plodding convoy escort work was not something that anybody in the Japanese Navy really wanted to do, nor had any particular interest in doing, and it would negatively affect your career if you did do it. So as a result, there was basically there wasn't any dedicated escort force or escort forces. The attitude was, well, the merchant ships will do what they will, and if there are troop convoys or something really important, we'll just use elements of the fleet. This is combined with the fact that the Japanese army was off invading various parts of mainland Asia for a good chunk of the interwar period, which drew down on the budget, which meant that Japan already had limited resources, and the Navy was having to both run combat operations off and on to support the army, and as the army's drawing down a lot of money, so the Navy had to try and focus on its resources on what its primary objective was, and its primary objective was to fight and destroy the American fleet. And so these smaller craft would come later if the resources ever became available, which of course they ended up not doing. And then you had a little bit of doublethink in that the Japanese were thinking, well, if we do absolutely end up needing anti-sub ships, they're going to be small and quick to build, so we can build them in wartime, pretty much like the British did with the Flower class. But at the same time, they then looked over at what the United States was building in terms of its sort of rearmament and battle force in the 1930s, and concluded that because the United States wasn't building its own coastal submarine fleet, they were mainly building big fleet submarines, and the US was also not building up a particularly large anti-submarine warfare department, at least as far as they could see, that therefore the US must be planning on a decisive fleet battle as well, with very little in the terms of commerce raiding submarine warfare. They basically concluded, the building strategy of the US indicates that they must be looking at a submarine strategy that's similar to our own, i.e. our submarines will mostly seek out and destroy enemy warships. Never mind the fact that their own plans said that if you were going to build anti-sub ships, you would do it quickly in wartime, and apparently forgetting that the US could potentially do the same thing. And then, of course, the war kicks off, and initially, between the fact they're on the offensive and the Mark 14 torpedo is next to useless, it doesn't seem like a particularly urgent thing. Also factored in was that the Japanese Navy had calculated roughly how many ships they thought they'd lose to submarine warfare in terms of their merchant shipping, and they thought the war wasn't going to last that long, maybe 2-3 years at most, and they calculated that if at the rate that they were doing things, the losses would be acceptable. By the end of the war at year 3, they would have lost a few 100,000 tons of merchant shipping, but they had the merchant shipping to absorb that kind of loss. Of course, what ended up happening is they lost far, far, far more merchant shipping than they thought they would, and the war went on a bit longer than they thought it would as well. So you had cultural, economic, tactical factors, all sorts of things, and then once it became very clear in kind of 1943 that you did need significant amounts of anti-submarine warfare escorts, well, by then it was basically too late. So all of these things and more combined to hamper the development of Japanese anti-submarine warfare doctrine in the first place, and by the time that everyone cottoned on to, right, we actually do need to form a separate anti-submarine warfare division and supply them with anti-submarine warfare ships and get crews out there, they just didn't have the resources or the time to do it. I mean, some ships like this one did get built, but it was far too little and far too late. Randy Topeka asks, many people have criticised Admiral Kurita for withdrawing at Samar, but what would he have been able to accomplish if he had pressed the attack? It's hard to imagine that Centre Force could have done anything appreciable with Task Force 34 and 38.1 responding to the threat, and 77.2 just a short ways away, albeit low on ammunition. Well, opinions are, again, it's one of these things that is very divided. You'll have some people who will absolutely insist that there's absolutely nothing that the Japanese could have done to hurt the amphibious landing forces, and that had worse come to worse, the US landing forces could have withdrawn. They seem to forget that the vast majority of the US amphibious attack groups and their transports were in no way, shape or form capable of even coming close to outrunning Centre Force. Centre Force could easily have run them down. Plus, where are they going to go? They can't run north because that's where Centre Force is. They can't run west because the Philippines are physically in the way. This map makes it slightly unclear because you've got these sort of the grey boxes pasted over it. But they can't really go south either because there is a bit more of the Philippines in the way. The only place they can really go is east, and if Centre Force was coming after them, it would have been coming in from sort of northeast. So really running north or running east, you probably would have run into Centre Force, and you can't outrun them, as I said. So yeah, and given the fact that most of the transports, etc., are minimally armed, even the destroyers could have split off and hunted down multiple ships on their own. So yeah, people who claim, oh well, the landing forces were absolutely fine, no, they really wouldn't. And that is a stance that's backed up by multiple historians. Look at Ian Toll's book, for example, that covers this part of the campaign, and by some of the people who are actually there, naval and ground army alike. Now, granted, at the point that this battle is fought, a good chunk of the troops are ashore, but a good chunk of their supplies are still on the ships, and the ships themselves are still quite useful, both in terms of transport, fire support, casualty evacuation, etc. So even if they're all forced to run away for a day or two, that's going to have a fairly significant impact on US operations, and if a reasonable number of them are sunk, that's going to have a significant impact on operations. Now, of course, part of the issue is that Kurita doesn't really pedal to the metal going full bore south, which he probably should have done, as early as he should have done. And when he eventually does, as you can see from the meanderings of that central red line, he spends an inordinate amount of time chasing after random taffy forces, and in turn being chased off by random taffy forces once Johnston and Roberts and so forth start salvoing torpedoes their way. Realistically, in a kind of not a perfect world, but a reasonable world, a lot of which kind of relies on Kurita realizing he is facing destroyers and escort carriers, not fleet carriers and cruisers. Kurita should have, once it became clear he'd gotten through the San Bernardino Strait without issue, he would have seen the US ships and just gone, okay, that's fine. My main objective is the landing area, so steer course 180 directly south, and we'll take some long-range salvos at these things as we go past. Because, you know, as the Japanese actually themselves said, there is no point in preserving the fleet if they lose the Philippines, because all the fleet's armament, equipment and crews are in Japan, which is to the north of the Philippines, but all the fuel they need is to the south, and the Japanese Navy actually evaluated it perfectly realistically. You know, if the Philippines fall and the fleet is combined, is all south, then they'll have all the fuel they'll need and none of the weaponry. And if the fleet is north when the Philippines fall, they'll have all of the weaponry they need and none of the fuel. Either one of which will render the fleet useless, therefore there's no point in preserving the fleet if we lose the Philippines. So, you know, if you show up and maybe the Taffies start launching some annoying airstrikes, and bear in mind, in the early stages of their airstrikes, they're coming in mainly with land attack weapons, just grin and bear it. Keep formation, hammer further south, get in amongst the landing craft, maybe throw a couple of salvos at the landing beaches for good measure, but you could do an awful lot of destruction of those forces. It wouldn't necessarily stop the invasion, but it would certainly give it a long pause whilst the US reorganises, recovers, repairs, and resupplies. And that might give some breathing room for the Japanese forces on Luzon itself to go on a counter-offensive. Now, are you eventually going to be closed down by Admiral Lee coming from the north and Admiral Kinkaid coming from the south and various aircraft carriers once they get their act together as well? Yes. Is it going to lead to devastating losses? Yeah, probably. Albeit you will have night to try and make an escape, at least, which will at least help somewhat with the aircraft issue, even if it won't necessarily help you with the surface action issues. But what's the alternative? You know, lose a bunch of ships anyway. Well, you've already lost Musashi, Maya, Atago, and Cow's on her way back crippled. So you've already lost ships. And if you go back now, well, you're going to lose them anyway to inactivity or just being picked off one by one, which is historically what happened. So if you're going to go down in a glorious fight, you might as well go down delaying the invasion of the Philippines, and potentially, if the stars align, might even do some serious damage or destruction to elements of the US surface fleet. Because yes, you know, Kinkaid's forces coming up from the south, that's exactly the enemy Yamato is designed to fight. Now, okay, Kinkaid's force has the firepower overall to eventually wear Kurita down and take him out, but I think at least a couple of US battleships would probably not be walking away from that fight in that circumstance. Now, if Lee's force comes down and pinces him at the same time, that's a different matter. But even then, it's still Yamato. In a surface action, she can probably take at least one battleship down with her. So yeah, in the abstract, Kurita really should have pressed on, but by the time he sort of was getting annoyed with chasing the Taffies, by that point he'd blown his chance. Robert Olweiler asks, after World War II, the US Navy would convert both Cleveland's and Baltimore's into a variety of missile cruisers, all of which became notorious for stability issues owing to the massive amount of top-heaviness from all the necessary sensor infrastructure required, to the point where explosive bolts were slaved to inclinometers just in case, to prevent them from capsizing. If the Royal Navy hadn't scrapped all of its cruisers, would any of them, i.e. the towns, counties and crown colonies, have fared better from a stability perspective if they were converted to a similar extent, and why? And were there any economically sensible measures the US Navy could have taken which would have remedied those issues? Now, obviously, this goes a bit beyond the Channel's scope, although since it does involve cruisers from the time of the Channel, I'll try to answer it, but obviously please note the missile era is not my area of speciality. And therefore, some of this information is my best approximation based on what I know, which is not as much as I'd like it to be. But, you know, someone who's a bit more specialised in this era can chime in the comments and correct anything that I may get somewhat wrong. But hopefully, based on the information that I've researched, hopefully most of this should be at least somewhat on point. The biggest problem when it comes to missile conversions, at least the early ones that you know, the Clevelands and Baltimores, this one, for example, is USS Little Rock, which still exists in Buffalo, New York. Obviously, right now, that I understand, there is a little bit of a weather issue going on there. But once they have, excavated Little Rock from under whatever many feet of ice and snow she's probably currently under, please go and visit them when the Buffalo Naval Park is open. They're a wonderful bunch of people. Now, back onto the 1950s, the biggest problem I think that US Navy has is, in some ways, weirdly enough, how quickly it advances its technology. Because Talos, which you can see being fired here, is a 1950s missile system. It's a pretty hefty missile. I mean, you can probably tell that from just looking at this picture. But also all the various radar systems are pretty darn heavy. And there's a lot of them, as you can see. I mean, you can also look at the giant dustbin of doom on HMS Victorious after she was refitted. And I think that's fundamentally the problem, because once you get this first generation of missiles and their radar, a lot of what goes on thereafter is trying to make the things not just more powerful and longer range, but also smaller and lighter weight. And in that respect, the Royal Navy almost would have, I guess, a benefit from the fact that Britain was pretty much flat broke for 10 years after the Second World War, because their missile systems took a lot longer to come online. So Sea Slug and Sea Cat come online in the 60s rather than the 50s for Talos. And so they would benefit from, a generation and a bit advance in electronics, etc. So and obviously some of the towns did survive, Gambia, Sheffield, Belfast, although Gambia's a crown colony, and I think Norfolk was around for a while as a training vessel as well. If they'd eventually gotten around to converting them into missile ships, they probably would have done a bit better than the Clevelands and Baltimores, purely because they wouldn't have to mount as much top weight, because the systems to guide the British missile systems, as I said, are just technologically speaking a little bit further down the line. Whereas for the US, once you've gone through all the expense of turning a cruiser into something like this, you don't then want to go, okay, well, we'll operate for 2 years, haul it back in, and completely refit it again for the next generation of systems, because that would be hilariously wasteful in terms of money. Now, that's not to say that some of the British systems aren't equally as implausibly large and silly as Talos. I mean, look at some of the launchers for Sea Slug, and, there's multiple reasons I call it the evil version of the British space program, quite apart from the multi-stage rocket boosters on the back. The launch facilities for Sea Slug on some Cold War ships pretty much resemble the launch facilities for a small space rocket. But considering the British had already gone with removing turrets on almost anything that wasn't Belfast, that gives you a nice place to put those, I guess. Sea Cat, on the other hand, was basically designed to replace 40mm Bofors systems on a like-for-like basis if you could. So that would probably be fine. You wouldn't have too many stability issues installing Sea Cat systems, for what benefit they may or may not be. But I have a feeling that, given how large Sea Slug was, and given how slowly British defence procurement was moving, not just in the 40s and 50s, but also in the 60s with that stupid defence white paper and so forth, if there was ever going to be a time where Britain was going to turn around and say, we've got some large-ish cruiser hulls left over, let's turn them into missile carriers, it probably would have been maybe as late as the 70s, when Gambia, Sheffield and Belfast were sitting away in reserves, and possibly even Tiger, Blake and Lion. And at that point, they probably would have stuck Cedar on, which would have then been a magazine fed twin-arm launcher. And again, significantly smaller and lighter than Sea Slug. I mean, everything this side of a Saturn V is smaller and lighter than Sea Slug. So a very late 1970s conversion to a mixture of Sea Dart and Sea Cat, that might well have worked, and obviously, for all the aforementioned reasons, had significantly less stability issues. But, converting British cruisers in the 50s to be missile ships would run into the rather major problem of Britain doesn't have any service to air missiles worth writing home about to stick on them. So I guess, well, there would be a great stability benefit in that, because you'd convert a ship that doesn't actually need any radar or missiles, because you don't have any. The Wind Thief asks, I recently learned that my grandfather had an uncle that served aboard USS Yorktown at the Battle of Midway. All I know is that his name was George Stacey, and he may have previously served aboard another aircraft carrier, possibly USS Langley. I was hoping you could direct me towards some more resources to learn about his service record. Well, I'll give you what help I can. Unfortunately, US Navy records for World War II are still largely undigitized, so my first advice would be to contact the Department of Navy Records of the US National Archives with as much information as you possibly can give them. Unlike a lot of UK records, as I said, US service records are a little bit behind on the digitization, so they're a bit harder to search remotely. Additionally, also it's World War II, and even in the UK, a lot of World War II service records are still not quite... well, you can access them, but you have to go through a few hoops, and it takes a while to learn how to do that in the UK, and I don't know what those hoops would be in the US. But that would be a good place to start. I did try and look through what online records are available for US service personnel in the 1930s and 1940s. Unfortunately, going just by George Stacey US Navy, turns out there's a fair number of George Staceys who were in the US military in the 1930s and 40s. So which of those you might be looking for, with the amount of information that's available just here, the name and potentially one ship, I'm afraid I couldn't tell you. I do know that Yorktown's muster rolls are available on the US National Archives as well. If you want to have a look through those, you might be able to find him there, and then that might give you a service number or something that might unlock further information. Sorry I can't be of too much more help, but unfortunately, if it's UK-based service records, or if it's US records that are slightly older, then I would be able to be of much more assistance. Unfortunately, late 30s, early 40s US records, I can really only point you in the direction of physical resources and numbers in the US where you might be able to find more. Lord Nelson asks, given the obvious danger of splinters, enemy snipers and cutlass-wielding boarders, why was body armour neglected by Napoleonic-era naval officers? Basically, risk-reward. To maintain body armour in a highly moist saltwater environment, that would be fun. Yeah. Just trying to stop it rusting away to uselessness would be an interesting exercise. Plus, the one thing you don't want to be wearing is a whole ton of steel if you end up overboard in the sea, which would be a risk. And enemy snipers, musket rounds, etc., during most of the Napoleonic era, they're gonna ignore any practical body armour. I mean, maybe if you had a cuirassier's breastplate, that might stop the occasional musket ball. But even then, given the close range of naval boarding actions, I wouldn't even necessarily guarantee that, to be perfectly honest. Cutlass wielding, yeah, it might help a little bit, from the melee actions, etc. And splinters to the torso, sure, but you've still got your arms exposed and your legs exposed. They have a lot of rather nasty blood vessels, and your head as well. So if you're going to protect yourself relatively realistically from splinters, you basically would need something approaching full plate armour. And granted, yes, that would also give you a huge advantage against cutlass wielding and dirk wielding, boarding axe, pike wielding, etc. boarders. The downside is, as I said, weight, the fact it takes ages to get on, which, okay, maybe if you're approaching action in an Age of Sail vessel, you would actually have the time to get it on, but where are you going to store it? There's not a lot of space, even for officers, apart from maybe the captain in the typical Napoleonic-era warship, plus the aforementioned maintenance problems. And if you do put on some kind of variant on the 16th or 17th century full-plate harness, then you are going to be a very shiny and obvious target for snipers and swivel guns and small cannons, none of which your armour is likely to stop. So, yeah, it's not worth it, really. You like one officer who pulled it off as a special trick, maybe, but generally, it wouldn't really be worth it. Plus, there's all sorts of cultural hang-ups about, officers showing courage to encourage the men, whereas if your first thing when the enemy's closing in is to disappear below decks, and then you show up 20 minutes later dressed head to toe in shining steel, that's kind of a way of telling everyone, hey guys, I'm very scared about dying, but I have the money, in theory, to stop that, maybe, and you don't. So yeah, that's not necessarily going to help. Crack Muppet asks, I recently learned USS Nevada took fire as a gunnery target for 5 days before being sunk by an aircraft-launched torpedo. Was this because the Navy was studying the damage intermittently, or for some other reason? They certainly weren't stopping to assess the damage. I mean, this was Nevada after she'd been used as an atomic bomb test ship, so no one was particularly keen to get aboard. But, nonetheless, she was shelled by Iowa and by cruisers and destroyers as well, and eventually having to be finished off. But there's not a huge amount of detail about that particular exercise, to be honest, other than obviously they were just using her as a gunnery target. However, you'd also have to account for the fact, by the way, there is actually aerial footage of Nevada being shot up, then torpedoed and then sunk, so you can go and find that if you like. But this is a picture from that period. Now, you will notice she is riding rather high in the water, which is to be expected. I mean, she's got no ammunition on board, she's got no supplies on board, she's got no crew on board, and she's got basically no fuel either. So she's riding very light. I would surmise, from the fact that she stayed afloat so long before having to be torpedoed, but then when she got torpedoed, she went down relatively quickly, that probably what's happening is, well, the cruisers and the destroyers are firing 5 and 6 inch shells at her. She's designed to withstand a lot more than that. So the fact that she stays afloat after an absolute barrage by cruisers and destroyers isn't really that much of a surprise. Her citadel will have kept her afloat even if the ends were riddled. Iowa shooting at her with 16 inch guns, in theory that should have sunk her, but again, no fuel, no ammunition. If few, if any, of the shells actually hit at the waterline or below, well, why would it sink? Because you're not going to blow it up with the magazines. And if you punch a bunch of holes in the top, again, why is it going to go down? It wouldn't. And even if 1 or 2 of the shells actually did hit just below or at the waterline, it's going to have a punched a just over 16 inch diameter hole. Assuming that somebody had closed up all the bulkhead doors, that might not, as long as it doesn't breach a major space like a magazine or a engine room or boiler room, it's not really going to do all that much. You'd have some localized flooding, but that's about it. So yeah, it's not necessarily a huge surprise. I think it was just a fact of there wasn't anything particularly to touch off, and she was riding high, so she had a lot of reserve buoyancy. So even if you did, as I say, get a few decent waterline or sub-waterline hits, then she could have taken on several thousand tons of water and still ended up at basically standard waterline level, hence the need for the torpedo. Leops 1984 asks, in a recent Drydock you discussed how effective a late war US Navy carrier group could hit a late war US Navy carrier group's defences. What about the other side of the war? How effective would the poorly trained aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy, circa say the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fare if they had to strike a similar era Imperial Japanese Navy fleet? Well, given that the Japanese Navy did occasionally get some heavy hits in on the US Navy of 44-45, Pennsylvania, Bunker Hill, Franklin, etc., etc., etc. If you somehow collected together most of the 1944 era Japanese Navy naval aviators and threw them up against a Japanese fleet or equivalent thereof, they'd probably do okay. if you go, I mean, the main thing, as I kind of talked about with the US forces versus their own ships, the main thing is just sheer numbers. If you can put together the numbers, then you could usually break through a combat air patrol. And once you've done that, it's really down to the anti-aircraft defences, which we know for the Japanese fleet weren't great. So even though Japanese aircraft were still a little bit trending on the fragile side, I'd expect them to be able to do a reasonable amount of damage to a similar level fleet before they obviously have expended all their munitions. It wouldn't be as good as a combined strike by an equivalent numbers US Navy force at the time, but in terms of offensive versus defensive, Japanese naval airstrike versus a Japanese naval fleet, the offensive certainly would have the advantage over the defense. And 2 or 3 of you asked pretty much the same question, which is basically, are there any special or favourite Christmas traditions that various navies have carried out during the time of the channel that the channel covers, and have you come across anything interesting that occurred on ships during the holiday season? Well, in terms of interesting things that happened during that period, Scharnhorst was sunk the day after Christmas in 1943. There's this rather fetching tradition, which you can see in the photo, which is apparently a Norwegian one, that on Christmas Day every Norwegian ship has to have a Christmas tree flying from its foremast. I'd love to be the sailor who has to pull that one off, except not really. And there's a few other interesting traditions. One of the longest standing ones in the Royal Navy apparently is that in the run-up to the Christmas period, the Christmas pudding has to be prepared by mixing in, obviously, the pudding mix with the rum, and that apparently is traditionally done by very specific members of the crew. Usually apparently the captain is involved, and for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, maybe to ensure that it's all distributed and mixed fairly, apparently the first mixture has to be done in some for the total of the whole ship or the shore establishment, which can lead to over a ton of heavily rum-based Christmas pudding mix being prepared, and is then split up between the various messes to be prepared into slightly more manageable portions. So that's always quite interesting, I think. If a captain wants to reward his crew, he might just keep going with the rum there just a little bit more than normal. I'm also given to understand that, at least as of World War II, a couple of other traditions developed in some navies, at least, one of which is kind of, I guess, in some ways modelled on some traditions from the medieval times, where the king and the jester would swap places, and in this case, the youngest crewman swaps places with the captain for the day. I'm not sure if that's actually a thing, but it's been recounted by a number of veterans as happening on occasion, which of course can lead to all sorts of fun shenanigans going on, although, as with the medieval and I think maybe even Roman traditions, the temporary captain does have to remember, of course, that the next day the actual captain will be captain again. And a very British tradition, apparently, of everyone exchanging a gift with your opposite number. And in true British tradition, that's usually in the form of something that's incredibly insulting to your mate. Because that's the way you express affection, by insulting each other, but not taking offence. And that brings us to the end of Drydock 228 Part 2. Hopefully you've enjoyed yourself. Well, if you've reached this part of the Drydock, I'm assuming that you have. And, well, if you are listening to this at the time it goes up for the Patreons, congratulations, you have survived 2022. And if you're listening to this on the day of release to the general public, congratulations, welcome to 2023. We're 1 year closer to the end of the world. That makes me feel happy.